New love is the best kind of love.
They kind of have this whirlwind romance, right? They fall fast.
And when it becomes more than just undeniable attraction.
His family had took her in. She felt like Joshua Nicker's family was her family.
You become desperate to hang on to your man, no matter the cost.
She's thinking that we're just gonna beat him up, teach him a lesson, but things take a turn.
In the chaos of that moment, it had gone further than I imagined.
Desperation can lead you down a dangerous road.
So she then had a decision to make about how much further she wanted to go.
And cost you everything that matters most.
She lost the things that were most important to her, the people who were most important to her, everything.
April 1st, 2017, Long Island, New York. The sun has yet to dawn on one of New York's most famous suburbs, one residents affectionately call Strong Island.
Long Island is broken up into primarily two counties. We have Nassau County and Suffolk County. One of the primary reasons is because the homes out here tend to be a bit less expensive. You know, even if you're looking for someplace that maybe has better school districts where you can really have that suburban living.
While Suffolk County offers upscale suburban living, it has its share of underserved communities too, like the small hamlet of Wyandanch.
Wyandanch, what you would consider an underprivileged neighborhood within the suburbs.
The things that you see in Wyandanch you won't really find in any other areas of either Suffolk or Nassau County, right? The abandoned houses, things of that nature.
It's low-income neighborhood. It's mostly African Americans, some Hispanics, but it's dead set in the middle of Suffolk County, Long Island.
Suffolk County police officers are on routine patrol when they spot a frantic man trying to get their attention.
He flagged down the police officers and he said that he had found a body. Police officers originally, I don't know if they believed him or not.
Hoping this is some kind of bad April Fool's joke, the officers follow the man to an abandoned house at the corner of 28th Street and Long Island Avenue. But once inside, no one's laughing.
So the space is completely run down. Clearly this is a house that no one has lived in quite some time. Paint is peeling, it's disheveled. It looks clearly like there's been some drug activity here, maybe some people who have been squatting.
The officers soon make a gruesome discovery. The body of a young black male is lying on the floor with a pool of dried blood around his head.
What was different about the condition of this body is it had no clothes on.
When homicide detectives arrive on the scene, they note the victim has sustained injuries consistent with a beating and possible strangulation.
Those are all indications that it's not an overdose. It's evidence of a physical altercation, a crime that likely resulted in this death.
Authorities begin collecting potential evidence. They find beer cans and duct tape, but the victim's personal effects are nowhere to be found.
There's no ID, there's no wallet, there's nothing there. And so to law enforcement, there are a couple of things going through their minds. Did this person, one, pass away here? Were they just kind of brought and left here?
Investigators could tell that the body had been there for quite some time because of the way his feet were positioned. It seemed like rigor mortis had already set and stiffening of the body limbs were already happening.
This also looks like someone that no one has been looking for. And so law enforcement are thinking, is this a situation where this is where he was staying and so he has no family?
The brutality of the slaying and the use of an abandoned house as the possible execution site leads detectives to believe that they could be dealing with either a gang or drug-related murder. The victim's body is transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy.
Through the dental records, they find out that this deceased person is Alan Moore.
22-year-old Alan Moore grew up on Long Island, where he endured a difficult childhood.
He didn't really have a family unit. His mother was unable to raise him. He didn't have any relationship with his father. His grandparents had at one point taken custody of him, but unfortunately they were not able to keep him, and so he had to go into the foster care system. Within the foster care system, he kind of bounced around from house to house.
Alan was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at a young age, which occasionally caused him to lash out. The instability of Alan's living situation did not help his mental health challenges.
For Alan to not really have family, or to not really have people who were behind him, it's very difficult to manage that on your own.
Alan lived in the foster care system until he aged out at 21.
Teens who age out of the foster care system, they don't have a home to go to. They often end up homeless. And so this was really what ended up being Alan Moore's fate, right? And so he kind of becomes transient. He's bouncing around from place to place, staying with friends.
Alan finally found some stability when he moved in with his grandfather in West Hempstead, New York, about 30 miles from Wyandanch.
He was trying to build a relationship where at some point he had moved in with his grandfather, and, you know, he really was trying to find a sense of belonging.
Hoping to make a fresh start, Alan got a job working as an overnight janitor at a soul food restaurant.
Alan's grandfather lived in a rough part of town, you know, at the corner of Terrace Avenue and Jackson Street in the Bedell Terrace apartments.
The Bedell Terrace apartments, they call it the Terrace Ave apartments. It's a low-income housing. It's a lot of crime there.
You know, this could have made it difficult for a kid like Alan, you know, someone who was already struggling trying to get his life moving in the right direction.
Now, investigators want to know how Alan's body wound up in an abandoned house, battered and bloody. An autopsy has confirmed that Alan was strangled to death.
The medical examiner then is able to see that he was, in essence, beaten, right? Almost tortured.
Investigators also learn Alan put up a fight.
There were skin cells underneath Alan's fingernails to indicate that he was struggling with somebody.
Given the state of his body, the medical examiner believes Alan died a few days before he was discovered.
His time of death was either the late hours of March 27th or early hours of March 28th.
The victim was found naked, but there are no signs of sexual trauma.
When you have a new body, it either indicates sexual assault or somebody's hiding identification. So whoever was responsible for this didn't want the person to be identified. It usually indicates that the person who's deceased has some type of relation to the person who's responsible.
Authorities canvass the neighborhood, but no one reports hearing or seeing anything suspicious.
When you think about a crime like this, it shows that there had to have been motive.
But who had motive to kill Alan Moore in such gruesome fashion? Little did police know Alan Moore had been the target of a sinister plot. A plot that, once exposed, would unveil a twisted web of love, loyalty, and deadly deception. On April 1st, 2017, the body of 22-year-old Alan Moore was found in an abandoned house on Long Island, New York. After conducting an autopsy, the Suffolk County medical examiner has confirmed Alan was beaten and strangled to death. Authorities learn Alan's brother, sister, and grandfather all live on Long Island, and they notify them of his death.
And when they speak with the family, it kind of hit a roadblock because Alan's sister tells detectives that she hadn't seen her brother in months.
The fact that they hadn't spoken to him in months was customary. They would hear from him for a little bit, and then he would disappear for maybe months at a time and then reappear. So when law enforcement comes around, they aren't really able to provide any information on who he's been running with.
But Alan's sister does give them a potential lead.
She says that Alan has been dating a woman named Nia Cleveland.
Investigators had suspected the motive for Alan's murder might be personal. Now they wonder if his girlfriend is somehow involved.
Nia tells the police that her and Alan dated, but they broke up about a month ago, and she hadn't seen or talked to him since March 12th or 13th.
Police ask Alan's girlfriend where she was on the night he was killed.
She's able to provide police officers with an alibi for the time frame, right, that they're thinking that Alan was killed. And with that time frame and where she says that she was, they're able to kind of clear her as a person of interest.
But Nia does point investigators to a potential motive.
A lot of people had said that he was really involved in some bad situation. Unfortunately, he was also known to walk around with a gun.
Investigators questioned people around Alan's neighborhood and learned that a month before his death, he was a suspect in a shooting at a Hempstead, New York bus station. As investigators look into the Hempstead shooting, they learn something else.
There was also an incident where Alan is jumped by a group of guys.
After searching police records, investigators learn Alan was jumped by a group of young black men about a month before his death. They beat him so severely, he had to be hospitalized for several days.
So now law enforcement are trying to figure out who these men were and why, right? And, you know, did they possibly come back to finish the job?
Investigators now have a possible motive for Alan Moore's murder, but it doesn't make finding his killers any easier.
There's so many different angles. And so trying to figure out who would want him dead, the possibilities for law enforcement and trying to trace back his life becomes very difficult.
Suffolk County Police have learned 22-year-old Alan Moore was severely beaten by a group of young men and hospitalized a month before his murder. They are also looking into allegations that Alan was involved in a local shooting around that same time. They wonder if these two incidents are related, and if they are, did they lead to Alan's untimely death? Police canvassed the Wyandanch neighborhood where Alan was found, questioning everyone they can.
Of course, in the neighborhood that this happens in, no one is talking to law enforcement, right? We're just kind of hearing through the grapevine of, you know, it might have been this person, it might have been connected to this, but they aren't really able to substantiate any of these links that they're just kind of hearing.
Police can't find Alan's phone, but they obtain a warrant to search his social media accounts.
They're able to get into his Facebook messages. And in these Facebook messages are countless messages between him and many other women. It's clear that he had been involved, right, with many different women and was open to being sexually involved with these different women.
Investigators do a deep dive into Alan's online messages. Could one of these women have information about what happened to Alan?
So now police officers are tasked with the daunting, possibility of reaching out or trying to figure out which one of these messages are actually related in any way to this crime. And so they had to kind of see which women did he actually meet up with.
Then, investigators finally uncover something promising. A message dated March 27th.
It just so happens to fall right around the time that they believe Alan was killed.
It's from a woman named Jaquana Bates, asking Alan if he'd like to get together and smoke some weed.
There's a little bit of a flirtatious nature to the text messages, right? That they're going to meet up.
Alan thought of himself as someone who liked to play around, saw a lot of women. So when Jaquana reached out to him, he thought there was a chance to, have a good time with her.
Investigators know Alan's last address was at the Bedell Terrace Apartments in Hempstead.
One of the steps the police used to figure out what happened was reliance on cameras. And because of the high crime history of the Terrace Apartments, there were plenty of cameras that were established in the area.
Police get the surveillance footage from the Bedell Terrace Apartments around the time that they believe Alan was murdered.
In footage time-stamped March 27th, 2:13 a.m., investigators see a white SUV pull up to the Bedell Terrace Apartments. Then, they see Alan Moore exit the building.
So at 2:13 a.m., they see Alan come out of his apartment and he goes into this car with a young woman. They can't see her face. She has a black hoodie on.
There was a guy in the front seat who got out and got in the back seat, and Alan jumped in the front seat, and the young lady wearing the hood got behind the wheel.
Additional CCTV footage tracks the SUV driving south on Terrace Avenue. The white SUV is captured on surveillance cameras intermittently for the next hour.
At 3:33 a.m., they see the white Chevrolet SUV pull up, and a red vehicle pulls up. A black male comes out of the vehicle and goes into the white Chevrolet SUV.
After 10 minutes, both vehicles leave the scene.
With the surveillance the investigators have on the vehicles, at approximately 4 a.m. is the last time that they have on site, so they lose them at that point.
Police run the license plates on the white SUV.
They were able to confirm that the SUV was registered to Daquana Bates.
Daquana Bates, the woman who sent Alan a message inviting him to meet up. Investigators are finally making headway, but then they hit a snag.
They're trying to figure out who this car belongs to, and they hit a roadblock because the registration and the license plates don't match.
One thing investigators have figured out is that the 3 people captured on video are somehow involved in Alan Moore's murder.
With the surveillance footage, investigators were actually able to confirm that these were the people that were with Alan the last time he was alive.
But police still have more questions than answers. If the woman in the footage is Daquana Bates, who is the other man in the white SUV? And who was driving the red sedan?
How do we understand who these people were in this red car and how they related to the white Chevrolet SUV?
Detectives want to bring Daquana Bates in for questioning. They're hoping she will be the key. Suffolk County Police have obtained CCTV security footage that captured murder victim Alan Moore being picked up by a woman and a man in a white SUV on the night of March 27, 2017.
After reviewing surveillance footage, the authorities were able to determine that a white SUV met up with a red sedan, and after about 10 minutes of observation, the police noticed that both of these cars rolled off in the same direction.
Investigators have yet to positively ID these people, but they suspect them of being involved in the 22-year-old's brutal slaying, even though the footage does not place them directly at the crime scene.
At this point in their investigation, the authorities are fairly certain that Daquana Bates is the registered owner of a white Chevrolet Trailblazer, a Trailblazer which is an exact match for the vehicle that picked up Alan Moore on March 27th.
But they can't say for certain that, it's Daquana that picked up Alan because the woman in the footage is wearing a hoodie.
When investigators run the plates on the red sedan, they don't match DMV records.
During their investigation, the authorities are able to find out that the red sedan is registered to a married couple, Larry and Sonetta Dennis, who live in Bellport, Long Island.
So now investigators are wondering, what connection does this couple have with Daquana Bates and to Alan Moore?
Investigators start digging into the Dennises and learn that Sonetta has a 27-year-old son named Joshua Nickens, who lives with her and Larry. When authorities run background checks, they discover Joshua did a stint behind bars at the Gouverneur Correctional Facility, and he was just released a month earlier, in February 2017.
As investigators begin questioning individuals in Joshua's Bellport neighborhood, they find out that he has a girlfriend, and her name is Daquana Bates.
26-year-old Daquana Bates grew up in Bellport, Long Island.
She's the middle child of 3 siblings. She has a younger brother and an older sister. Father wasn't really into life, raised by a single mom who was really doing the best she could to raise 3 kids on her own.
At some point, Daquana's mother moved them to Hempstead.
Hempstead is kind of known for being a lower income area of Nassau County, and so we kind of know that this family is doing the best that they can, what they've been given.
By most accounts, Daquana stayed out of trouble. She graduated from Hempstead High School in 2010.
We know from her family members that, Daquana was a relatively good student in high school.
At a young age, Daquana got pregnant and gave birth to a baby boy. Now, a single mom like her own mother, Daquana realized she didn't want that kind of life for herself and her child.
When you've grown up in a single-parent household and doesn't really feel like she has any father figures, men kind of possibly coming in and out of the home, and so there's this kind of yearning, right, for that family unit.
Then, Daquana finds what she has been looking for when she meets Joshua Nickens.
She meets Joshua, and they kind of have this whirlwind romance, right? They fall fast, and Daquana falls hard.
Joshua brought her home to meet his mother, Sunetta Dennis, and his stepfather, Larry Dennis.
My understanding is that Sunetta's a strong character. She's the matriarch of this family.
For the first time, she's kind of seeing what a family unit looks like, right? Joshua comes from a home with mom and also has his stepdad, and they welcome Daquana in kind of with open arms, right? And she starts to feel like she really is a part of this family. And so that really binds Daquana to Joshua very quickly.
But what Daquana didn't know yet was that Joshua was in trouble.
Sometime in the relationship, Joshua does a short stint in jail. But at this point in the relationship, Daquana is sticking by her man, right? She decides to stay with him. She waits for him to come out.
Daquana and her infant son move in with Larry and Sunetta while Joshua is in jail.
Daquana felt like she had unconditional love from the Dennis family. They took her in without questions asked, and they took care of her child that wasn't their grandchild. She felt love and she felt an allegiance to them just as much as she did for Joshua.
As investigators worked to connect the dots between Daquana Bates and Alan Moore, they learned Daquana wasn't the only person Larry and Sunetta Dennis opened their home to.
If we think about Larry and Sunetta Dennis, they're kind of like the halfway house, right, for people. They're kind of taking people in, and they are very generous with their home. We know that they take in Daquana. We know that at some point Alan is staying there.
In a surprising discovery, police learn Alan's ex-girlfriend, Nia Cleveland, is the daughter of Sunetta Dennis and Joshua Nickens' stepsister.
She was the reason why Alan Moore was often in Bellport at the Dennis home, and that's how he came to know them.
They knew he was struggling. He was bouncing from couch to couch at the time, and they wanted to help him out, and it wasn't a problem for Sunetta or Larry to let him stay there for as long as he needed.
But now, police are interested in speaking with the Dennises to find out what they might know about Alan Moore's murder.
Authorities wonder what could possibly have happened between Alan and the Dennises to lead to Alan suffering such a violent demise.
Now police consider a new motive. Did Nia find out about the other women Alan was messaging?
Is this a type of situation with a lover's scorn? Did she find out that Alan had been cheating on her behind her back and therefore gets revenge in this way?
Did Nia ask her brother Joshua to take care of Alan for her?
Or did Joshua find out what Alan had done to his sister and decide to take matters into his own hands?
Is Joshua the other man in the white SUV that picked up Alan that night?
Authorities are considering one more theory. Is it possible Daquana Bates had teamed up with Joshua Nickens and Larry Dennis to set a trap?
And Alan Moore walked right into it.
Suffolk County Police have reviewed video evidence that captured Daquana Bates's white SUV picking up Alan Moore on the night he was murdered. And they know she later met up with a red sedan registered to Larry Dennis. As detectives work to piece together the timeline of events leading up to Alan's murder, they get an anonymous tip.
Joshua's running around town telling people about that he handled his business, that he took care of Alan.
Ironically, Joshua's the one who's talking. You know, criminals do that. Sometimes they have to brag, you know. And he's telling people that, you know, he had to set them straight.
Authorities obtain search warrants for Daquana's SUV, Larry's sedan, and the Dennis home. Among the potential evidence they recover at the residence are 2 electronic tablets, a mini computer, and a cell phone. Police also find 2 cell phones in Daquana's SUV. The cell phones proved to be the most telling. Now that authorities have the cell phone evidence, they track the movements of their suspects on the night of Alan's murder.
They were able to find the tower pings on the cell phones, which wind up indicating that these cell phones were at the scene of the crime, at the time indicated where Alan Moore was murdered.
They know that at some point in time, right, all of these people were together. We know that Daquana picks up Alan. We know Joshua's in the car. Larry joins Joshua and Daquana and Alan. But from that moment after, we have no idea what happens. They don't know exactly what happened at Wyandanch.
The cell phones become a very important piece of evidence, serving as a smoking gun in this case. One of the cell phones is registered to Daquana, and the other cell phone is registered to Alan.
Now, when they trace the cell phone towers and pings, they're able to determine that, everybody was together in Hempstead. And then 2 of them go to Wyandanch. And not only that, they met up in the exact same place where Alan is murdered. But one of them didn't return.
And authorities still don't know who killed Alan Moore. Investigators obtain arrest warrants, and on July 11th, 2017, Joshua Nickens and Daquana Bates are taken into custody in Shirley, New York.
Once Joshua and Daquana were taken in custody, they were separated and they were questioned separately.
Joshua was very quiet. Police brought in some food and fed him, hoping that would make him a more cooperating witness. However, all he did was ask for his attorney.
Joshua had just been released from prison 6 months earlier, and now he's possibly facing another prison sentence. That had to be weighing on his mind.
Across the hall, Daquana is also proving to be uncooperative.
Daquana's likely thinking, we're in this all or nothing. And so she makes the decision that she's going to go 100% full force with Joshua and do this for him, right? And stay tight-lipped.
Aside from protecting her man, there's something else weighing on Daquana. She is several months pregnant with Joshua's baby.
She's just thinking about the life that's growing inside of her and how she cannot allow Joshua to go back to prison and not be a father to her child.
Later that same day, police arrest a 3rd suspect in Alan Moore's murder, Joshua's stepdad, Larry Dennis. But unlike Joshua and Daquana, Larry is more than willing to talk.
Larry Dennis, when he was arrested, told detectives plenty.
Larry tells police that Alan dated his stepdaughter, Nia Cleveland, in 2016, and that Alan frequently stayed at the Dennis home while Joshua was in jail. But Larry says in February of 2016, Alan took advantage of their generosity.
We find out that Alan stole a PlayStation from the home.
At some point, Joshua makes a call back home, and they're telling him about the fact that this guy, Alan, had the nerve to steal the PlayStation. This is how infuriating the parents were about this. Like, somebody coming into the home that they allowed and they fed you, and you got the nerve to steal the PlayStation out of the house?
Sunetta, she feels hurt when she feels like this person who'd been in their home has betrayed them. And Josh is her son. He wants to do right by his mom, and she wants him to do what needs to be done.
He becomes very agitated. He takes this very personally. And so while he's in prison, he's already kind of making claims that, when he gets out, Alan is gonna pay.
Larry says when Joshua was released from prison in February 2017, he told Larry, Sunetta, and Daquana that they needed to get revenge on Alan, and they came up with a plan.
He told them of his involvement, and he told them that he was aware that Josh had gone too far, done more than what the plan was.
Larry says the plan was to rough up Alan for stealing the PlayStation and teach him a lesson about disrespecting people. But Joshua went overboard.
Larry didn't know what was going to happen either, because he was easily led by those around him.
He, in his statement to law enforcement, notes that Joshua took things too far, that this wasn't their intention, but that Joshua has a tendency to do this, right? To take things too far.
Larry says he tried to stop his stepson, but he was out of control. Larry said he regretted his involvement in Alan's murder. As investigators had suspected, Alan Moore was killed in a revenge plot, but not for cheating on Nia Cleveland. It was over a video game. A few months later, on September 18th, Sunetta Dennis is arrested at a local restaurant. Like her husband, she gives a full confession about her involvement in Alan's murder.
It's interesting that the parents are the ones who ended up talking, because they were the primary ones who were egging on this revenge plot, this teaching Alan a lesson. I think in all of this, no one anticipated that Joshua would take things to the level that it went. And so once it got that far, it's almost as if Larry and Sunetta had already decided that they're not going down for this.
Sunetta reiterates that the plan was to beat Alan up, not kill him. Sunetta says in the early morning hours of March 27th, Larry called and asked her to meet him, Joshua, and Daquana in West Hempstead. Then Sunetta returned home, where she waited for Larry to call her to pick him up. She says Daquana and Joshua returned home several hours later, at 7 a.m.
At that point, Daquana told her that Alan was dead and that Joshua strangled him. I don't think Sunetta thought it was going to go that far. I honestly don't think any of them did. But by the time, it was no turning back.
Suffolk County Police have arrested 26-year-old Daquana Bates, 27-year-old Joshua Nickens, and 49-year-old Larry Dennis for the murder of Alan Moore. 43-year-old Sunetta Dennis, who has yet to be charged in connection with the murder, says her son Joshua killed Alan in a revenge plot gone awry. Eventually, Daquana also makes a full confession.
Daquana, along with Larry and Sunetta, said that Joshua came up with a plan to get Alan back for stealing his PlayStation and disrespecting the family, and that he asked her to help him along with the plan.
She had this family that she went home to, and they took care of her and she took care of them, and she had an allegiance to that family because of that.
That allegiance drove Daquana to make a fateful decision. She says, at Joshua's request, she found Alan online and sent him a message.
Daquana lures Alan in through a Facebook message, posing as someone who wants to get to know him, says that, do they want to smoke or whatever.
Alan fell for the ruse and agreed to meet Daquana on the night of March 27, 2017. Daquana says before arriving, they dropped Larry off on a side street.
Daquana picks him up at that apartment where he's staying at in West Hempstead at 2:13 a.m. and with Joshua in the car.
Daquana tells Alan that Joshua is her brother and that she needs to drop him off somewhere. And after that, they can go smoke weed.
Alan says, no problem, right? Doesn't see an issue with this.
From there, they drove to the location where Larry was waiting.
His specific role wasn't clear at the beginning, but it later emerged that he was a big guy, so he was sort of like the projected muscle. He was there for intimidation.
When Alan saw Larry, he became alarmed, sensing he was in danger.
Alan recognizes Larry. Knowing what he did, he jumps out of the car and starts running. Joshua and Larry catch up with Alan, pistol whip him, get him back in the car, tie him up.
Daquana tells police that after a brief meeting with Sunetta, she, Joshua, and Larry drove around until they found an abandoned house in Wyandanch. Larry stayed in the car while she and Joshua took Alan into the basement.
Daquana's thinking that we're just gonna beat him up, teach him a lesson, teach him not to disrespect our home, and then we're gonna leave him there.
Once in the basement, Daquana says she kicked Alan.
Daquana had signed up for a beating. She was fine with kicking him, she was fine with hitting him. It became something more than that.
At some point, Daquana gets concerned. She watches Joshua start to choke Alan and continue to choke Alan to the point where He's losing breath. He's losing consciousness.
Josh had a ligature around Alan's neck, and he was strangled to death in front of her eyes.
There's a lot of things going through Daquana's head, I'm sure, trying to figure out what exactly did she wrap herself into. Daquana almost has to make a decision on the spot, right? What am I going to do? And so in this moment, she's thinking, we're a family, and so we're going to deal with this together.
Daquana says they stripped Alan's clothes, collected his belongings, and returned home. That's when Joshua realized he lost something that could tie him back to the murder.
Joshua realizes that he loses his phone, and Sunita goes back to where they met up with each other before to see if they can find Josh's phone somewhere on the floor.
But the phone is never recovered. Daquana says later that day, they burned Alan's clothes and belongings. On March 1st, 2019, authorities had enough to charge Joshua Nickens.
We took a plea deal. He pled guilty to murder in the first degree, 2 counts of murder in the second degree, and 1 count of kidnapping in the first degree. He was sentenced to 20 years to life.
At the sentencing hearing, Suffolk County District Attorney Timothy D. Sini said he believed Joshua got what he deserved.
The district attorney said that Alan's murder was a heinous act that was fueled by revenge. Kill somebody for suspecting that they stole a video game, that's just incomprehensible.
Sunetta Dennis was charged with murder in the second degree, and Larry Dennis was charged with murder in the second degree and kidnapping in the first degree. Daquana Bates was charged with murder in the second degree and kidnapping in the first degree.
Daquana eventually took a deal, resulting in her plea to a lesser charge of manslaughter, and as a result, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Nia Cleveland was cleared of any wrongdoing in Alan's murder. The people responsible for his senseless murder were brought to justice. But Alan Moore had long been a victim of a system that failed him.
You have to feel for a person like Alan. At first, he was failed by his family. Then he was failed by the foster care system. And then he was failed by the mental health system.
Daquana Bates's poor choices may have not cost her life, but they cost her everything that mattered.
It's easy sometimes to sort of not think about what defendants go through, because especially when they've done something horrible or taken part in something horrible. Daquana came from little, never had much. So someone like that, people are motivated to hold on to what they have, however little it is. In her case, it led her to make some terrible choices, and it prevented her from pushing back on people who had some bad ideas.
It's a tragic turn of events for a young woman who ended up sacrificing everything for her man.
Daquana is not the first woman nor the last who is going to find herself in a situation like this when she falls very hard for Joshua, who seems to be a representation of what any woman would want in a man, right? Somebody who's going to protect you at all costs, somebody who's going to provide for you. And so for women who don't have that, who don't come from those backgrounds, ending up in such unhealthy relationships and having to make difficult decisions.
Some women take making sacrifices for the good of the family to a whole new level. For some, it means protecting them by standing by your man, no matter the cost. But when the cost is your freedom, your family, and your man, you have to ask yourself, did you make the right choice?
The rain over Mansfield, Ohio, on that bitter November evening in 2001 didn't just fall. It clung to the asphalt like a shroud, washing away the traces of a town whose quiet surface masked a rotting underside. This was a place where people knew their neighbors' names, waved from their front porches, and locked their doors twice after dark. Not because crime was rampant, but because the silence here felt heavy, pregnant with things left unsaid. On a modest street lined with maple trees whose skeleton branches scraped against the low, bruised sky. 36-year-old Sarah Henderson walked up her driveway, keys in hand, her breath pluming white in the freezing air. She had spent the evening working late at the local community library, organizing old county ledgers, lost in the hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of aging paper. She never unlocked her front door. She never made it inside to set her keys on the kitchen counter. By morning, Sarah Henderson had vanished completely, leaving behind a chilling cold case that would tear the heart out of a complacent community and plunge investigators into a psychological labyrinth where the monster wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was standing right in the center of the room, holding the flashlight. When local police arrived the next afternoon following a frantic call from her terrified coworkers, the scene inside Sarah's home was an eerie tableau of interrupted life. The front door was unlocked, resting half an inch ajar, letting the biting November wind draft across an immaculate hardwood floor. A half-empty cup of chamomile tea sat on the side table beside the living room sofa, still showing a faint ring of moisture, while her winter coat lay neatly draped over the armchair. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no violent struggle, and no frantic fingerprints smeared across the windows. Her purse rested undisturbed on the dining room table, her wallet fat with cash, her car keys resting squarely beside a stack of unmailed letters. It was as if Sarah had simply stepped out of her physical skin and dissolved into thin air, leaving a sterile, perfectly preserved room that hummed with an unsettling, breathless vacuum. Within hours, the quiet neighborhood of Mansfield turned into a frantic staging ground for emergency search parties, blaring sirens, and flashing red and blue lights that stained the wet pavement. Police dogs were brought in, sniffing frantically along Sarah's front porch, down the slick concrete driveway, and out to the curb where the asphalt met the street, only for the tracking hounds to abruptly stop, lift their heads, and whine in confusion, completely losing the scent as if Sarah had been lifted into the sky by an invisible hand. Investigators fanned out across the surrounding blocks, questioning neighbors who peered through Venetian blinds with wide, suspicious eyes. The consensus on the street was instantaneous and absolute. No one had seen a thing, no one had heard a scream, and no strange vehicles had broken the monotony of the rainy Tuesday night. Among the first neighbors to step forward and offer his assistance to the frantic police was Arthur Miller, a 50-year-old local contractor who lived just 3 houses down from Sarah. Arthur was the quintessential neighborhood fixture, a man who spent his weekends clearing leaves from elderly residents' gutters, chatting amiably with local patrol officers, and offering a comforting, deeply empathetic shoulder to Sarah's devastated family. With tears glistening in his eyes, Arthur stood before the local news cameras on the 3rd day of the search, his voice trembling with manufactured grief as he described how he had been sitting on his front porch late that Tuesday night, smoking a pipe and watching the quiet avenue, paying close attention because he always looked out for Sarah. He was the quintessential helpful neighbor, the reassuring anchor of a community spinning out of control. "I stayed up past midnight," Arthur told the lead detective during a recorded interview on day 4, his expression a masterpiece of sorrowful earnestness. "I saw the rain coming down hard. I saw a dark sedan slow down near her driveway around 11:30, but it drove off without stopping. I wish I had walked over there. I kick myself every single day for not walking down and checking on her." That single statement became the cornerstone of the initial investigation. Police spent months chasing phantom dark sedans across Richland County, combing through vehicle registration logs, interviewing out-of-state motorists, and running down every dead-end tip that pointed toward transient predators passing through the Rust Belt. But the dark sedan didn't exist. It was a phantom narrative crafted by a master manipulator, designed to push investigators away from the curb and out toward the empty highways, ensuring that the eyes of the law remained focused on the horizon while the truth sat comfortably 3 doors down, drinking coffee and watching the police tape flutter in the wind. As the weeks melted into biting winter months, the search for Sarah Henderson ground to an agonizing, structural halt. The media vans packed up their satellite dishes, the search parties dissolved into bitter memory, and the active investigation slipped slowly into the suffocating archives of the Cold Case Division. The file was placed inside a heavy manila folder, stamped with a bright red label, and tucked away in a steel filing cabinet in the basement of the Mansfield Police Department, left to gather dust as the town tried desperately to forget the ghost of Elm Tree Lane. For 25 years, Sarah's parents grew old waiting for a knock that never came. Her younger sister carried a crushing, silent grief that eroded her marriage, and the town of Mansfield moved on, wrapping its collective denial around the mystery like a winter coat. Yet, deep within the dark archives of forgotten evidence, the physical items recovered from Sarah's untouched living room remained preserved in airtight packaging, waiting for a technological evolution that the investigators of 2001 could only dream of. The turning point didn't come from a confession, a deathbed revelation, or a tip called into an anonymous hotline. It came from the quiet, unyielding hum of a robotic sequencer in a state forensic laboratory 2 decades later, a microscopic breakthrough that would extract an invisible, microscopic trace of DNA from the rim of the half-empty chamomile teacup left on Sarah's side table, matching a profile that was already sitting in plain sight on the very first page of the original 2001 police report. The name attached to the DNA profile was not a transient truck driver, an escaped convict, or an anonymous stranger passing through the Rust Belt. It belonged to Arthur Miller, the helpful neighbor who had stood on the front porch with tears in his eyes, the man who had fed false leads to the detectives, the man who had been interviewed as the key witness on day 4 of the investigation, and who had lived peacefully just 3 doors down for 25 years, mowing his lawn, painting his fence, and smiling at the children walking past the very house where he had committed an unmentionable act of premeditated horror. The cold air inside the Richland County Forensic Laboratory hummed with a sterile, relentless intensity on that damp Tuesday morning in November 2026, exactly 25 years after Sarah Henderson vanished into the Ohio fog. Senior forensic analyst Dr. Marcus Vance stared at the glowing amber display of the capillary electrophoresis instrument, his eyes tracking the jagged fluorescent peaks of an electropherogram that defied every statistical probability of a cold case. The microscopic sample extracted from the rim of the half-empty chamomile teacup, recovered from Sarah's living room table on the very first day of the 2001 investigation, had finally yielded a complete, high-stringency short tandem repeat DNA profile. For 2 decades, the degraded touch DNA had been nothing more than an unreadable smear, a frustrating genetic ghost buried beneath the limitations of older technology. But with the advent of ultra-sensitive forensic genetic genealogy and advanced magnetic particle extraction protocols, the invisible barrier had shattered. The genetic signature was not a degraded partial match or an unidentifiable trace belonging to an anonymous transient. It was sharp, pristine, and unmistakably singular. Dr. Vance's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he cross-referenced the resulting profile against the National Combined DNA Index System and the Regional Unsolved Violent Crime Repository. Within milliseconds, the system flashed a high-priority administrative alert, pulling up a file that had rested undisturbed in the physical archives of the Mansfield Police Department since the winter of 2001. The name attached to the genetic profile wasn't a stranger, wasn't an elusive interstate truck driver, and wasn't a phantom predator passing through the Rust Belt. It belonged to Arthur Miller. The weight of the algorithmic match dropped over the laboratory like a leaden blanket. Arthur Miller, the 50-year-old local contractor who had lived just 3 houses down from Sarah Henderson, the man who had stood on the wet pavement during the November 2001 search parties offering warm coffee to freezing patrol officers, the pillar of the community who had spent a quarter of a century mowing his lawn, painting his white picket fence, and attending Sunday parish dinners in plain sight of the very home where a young woman's life had been abruptly extinguished. The realization sent a sharp, breathless jolt through the investigative team. The monster hadn't slipped away across state lines under the cover of a rainy midnight. He hadn't abandoned his vehicle in a distant forest or fled to a foreign country. He had stayed right where he was, watching the police canvass the neighborhood, inserting himself into the daily rhythm of the investigation, and whispering fabricated leads directly into the ears of the lead detectives. Within hours of the laboratory confirmation, An emergency briefing was convened in the subterranean war room of the Mansfield Police Division. Chief of Detectives Evelyn Carter, whose career had begun as a rookie patrol officer during the initial 2001 canvass of Elm Tree Lane, stood before a massive magnetic whiteboard that dominated the center of the room. Pinned across the scarred surface were faded Polaroid photographs of Sarah Henderson's living room, yellowed handwritten interview logs from November 25 years ago, and a single, glossy contemporary photograph of Arthur Miller taken just 3 days prior by an undercover surveillance unit. Arthur, now 75 years old, was captured stepping out of his weathered Ford pickup truck at a local hardware store, wearing a faded plaid flannel shirt, leaning slightly on a wooden cane, looking every bit the harmless, aging retiree. "We are not dealing with a passive bystander who happened to live down the street," Chief Carter told the assembled squad of federal agents and state investigators, her voice hard and flat, cutting through the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. "We are looking at a calculated, highly compartmentalized predator who used proximity as a camouflage and community service as an absolute shield. For 25 years, Arthur Miller walked among us, shook our hands, and watched Sarah's parents pass away believing their daughter had been swallowed by the open highway. Every search party he joined, every news interview he gave, and every false lead he fed to the press was an active psychological maneuver to direct our gaze outward while his own hands were entirely clean in the eyes of the public. The investigative mandate was absolute and immediate, but executing an arrest on a pillar of the community after a quarter of a century required an airtight judicial architecture. A team of digital forensics experts and financial auditors was spun up overnight to dissect every facet of Arthur Miller's life between 2001 and 2026. They pulled historical phone toll records, mortgage documents, tax assessments, and local business transactions, searching for the hidden structural cracks in a life built entirely upon a foundation of absolute deception. What they discovered beneath the placid surface of Arthur's contracting business was a sprawling, subterranean network of isolation, a man who had systematically severed ties with distant family members, lived entirely off cash transactions for decades, and maintained a secluded, heavily reinforced storage locker on the industrial outskirts of Mansfield that had never been flagged or searched during the original 2001 investigation. By dawn on Wednesday, November 18, 2026, the operational plan was finalized. A joint tactical unit consisting of Richland County Sheriff's deputies and state criminal investigators surrounded Arthur Miller's quiet suburban residence on Elm Tree Lane. The morning was bitterly cold, mirroring the weather conditions of that fateful night 25 years prior, with a heavy, gray frost clinging to the withered brown grass of the front lawns. There were no flashing sirens, no blaring megaphones, and no theatrical media broadcasts. The takedown was executed with chilling, surgical precision. 2 unmarked tactical vehicles pulled silently into Arthur's driveway, blocking the weathered Ford pickup, while plainclothes investigators walked up the concrete steps and knocked firmly on the front door. Arthur Miller opened the door himself. He was wearing a soft knit cardigan over a button-down shirt, his silver hair neatly combed, holding a ceramic mug of steaming black coffee in his right hand. For a split second, his pale blue eyes registered the faces of the men standing on his porch, not with sudden panic or wild desperation, but with a cold, terrifying stillness that chilled the seasoned investigators to their core. There was no theatrical gasp, no feigned confusion, and no indignant protest of innocence. Arthur simply looked down at the coffee mug in his hand, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set the ceramic cup down on the entryway table beside the door. The exact same gesture, the exact same posture of a man quietly welcoming unexpected guests into a home that had harbored an unspeakable secret for a quarter of a century. "You took your time," Arthur said, his voice remarkably steady, devoid of tremor or strain, echoing softly through the quiet suburban foyer as the steel handcuffs clicked into place around his aging wrists. The interrogation room inside the Mansfield Police Department headquarters was a windowless box of cinderblock and institutional green paint, smelling faintly of old floor wax and decades of cold coffee. It was noon on Wednesday, November 18, 2026, and the heavy metal door clicked shut with a definitive, mechanical thud that reverberated through the small space like a distant gunshot. Arthur Miller sat unshackled at the center of the bolted steel table, wearing his gray knit cardigan, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He did not look like a cornered beast or a panicked fugitive. He looked like a grandfather taking a quiet moment of respite in a public library. Across the table sat Chief of Detectives Evelyn Carter and Special Agent Thomas Vance of the State Criminal Investigation Division, their eyes locked onto Arthur's impassive face, while a high-definition digital camera mounted in the upper corner of the room whirred silently, recording every micro-expression, every blink, and every breath of a man who had successfully outrun the law for 25 years. Chief Carter didn't open a file folder, nor did she slide a stack of photographic evidence across the laminate tabletop. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her forearms on the steel surface, her voice dropping into a register that was dangerously quiet and intensely deliberate. 25 years, Arthur, Carter said, her gaze unblinking. For 25 years, Sarah Henderson's mother woke up every single morning walking past a calendar that stopped dead on November 26, 2001. She spent a quarter of a century wondering if her daughter was tossed into a ditch, dumped in a quarry, or buried beneath the cold Ohio clay. And every single one of those mornings, you walked out your front door, got into your truck, waved to the neighbors, and drove to your construction jobs knowing precisely where every single second of that night went. Arthur shifted slightly in his chair, the fabric of his cardigan whispering against the metal backrest. He didn't flinch, nor did he look away. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his thin lips, not a grin of amusement, but the wry expression of a man acknowledging a chess move played by a worthy opponent. He slowly raised his right hand, rubbed his chin with his thumb and forefinger, and let out a soft, low sigh that carried the weight of a long-exhausted actor stepping off a stage after a very long run. "You know, Detective," Arthur began, his voice surprisingly smooth, rich, and steady for a man of 75, devoid of the gravelly tremor usually associated with aging lungs. People watch too many movies. They think monsters live in caves, or drive beat-up vans with no license plates, or leave frantic notes written in blood on the mirror. They spend all their time looking for shadows in the woods, completely forgetting that the safest place to hide a secret is right out in the open, wrapped in a friendly smile and a clean flannel shirt. Agent Vance tapped a single finger against the tabletop, his eyes narrowing. "That friendly smile didn't protect you from the science, Arthur. We pulled your DNA profile off the rim of the teacup Sarah left on her living room table the night she vanished. Not a trace from a random transient. Not a ghost from the highway. Your touch, your genetic signature, preserved in an airtight evidence bag for a quarter of a century, waiting for technology to catch up with what you thought you got away with." For the first time since the arrest, Arthur's expression flickered. The placid, grandfatherly mask slipped just a fraction of an inch, revealing the cold, calcified core beneath. He didn't deny the science. He didn't ask to see the lab reports, and he didn't demand an attorney. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and locked his pale blue eyes onto Agent Vance with a look of clinical, detached curiosity. "Science is a funny thing," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping into a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence as he recounted the events of that fateful November night without a shred of hesitation or remorse. "Back in 2001, you detectives were so convinced it was an abduction because you couldn't fathom the alternative. You looked at the open front door, the half-empty cup of tea, and the car keys on the table, and your minds immediately raced outward. You chased shadows across 3 states because you wanted a grand, cinematic mystery. You never bothered to look inward, because looking inward meant admitting that the danger wasn't a stranger passing through your town. It was the quiet man 3 houses down who always remembered to bring your trash cans back up the driveway." The confession, when it began to unspool in the stale air of the interrogation room, was not delivered in a burst of emotional panic or weeping contrition. It was laid out like a meticulous blueprint, a cold, calculated accounting of a crime that had been planned not in a frenzy of violent passion, but with the quiet, methodical patience of a predator studying a domestic routine. Arthur detailed how he had watched Sarah Henderson's evening schedule for weeks, her Tuesday night library shifts, her precise arrival times, the exact moment she unlocked her front door and set her keys on the table before walking into the kitchen to put the kettle on for tea. She didn't scream, Arthur said softly, his voice hanging in the air like a shroud. There was no struggle, no broken glass, no chaotic mess. When you live 3 houses away, you don't need to break down a door. You simply wait until the kettle starts to whistle, step across the threshold while the neighborhood is distracted by the autumn rain, and remind her that doors left unlocked in quiet towns are an invitation to the neighbors. Outside the interrogation room, standing behind the two-way glass in the darkened observation corridor, Chief Carter watched the monitor as Arthur's words flowed effortlessly from his lips. The sheer casualness of his delivery, describing the premeditated destruction of a human life as if he were recounting a routine home repair job, sent a collective shiver through the assembled detectives and federal agents. For 25 years, Mansfield had comforted itself with the comforting illusion that Sarah Henderson had fallen victim to an external, faceless evil that had vanished into the ether. But sitting in that room was the terrifying reality. The monster was a homegrown fixture, nurtured by the very complacency of suburban life, protected by the quiet anonymity of neighborly trust, and hiding in plain sight while the entire town wept for a ghost. The pale, sickly morning light of November 19, 2026, cut through the vertical blinds of the Mansfield Police Department interrogation room, casting long, fractured shadows across the scarred steel table. Arthur Miller remained seated in the exact same posture he had maintained for hours, his hands resting calmly in his lap, his expression untouched by exhaustion or the crushing reality of an airtight capital murder charge. Chief Evelyn Carter and Special Agent Thomas Vance stood silently on opposite sides of the room, listening as Arthur continued to weave the intricate, horrifying narrative of how he had managed to conceal Sarah Henderson's remains for a quarter of a century right under the nose of local law enforcement. People always assume that hiding a body requires digging a deep grave in the middle of a desolate forest, driving hundreds of miles into the mountains, or dropping weights into a murky lake, Arthur said, his voice carrying the calm, educational tone of a university professor lecturing a class of attentive students. He slowly rubbed his knuckles against the laminate tabletop, a faint, chilling smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That is the mistake amateurs make. They panic, they rush, and they leave massive geographical footprints that tracker dogs and satellite imaging can spot in a heartbeat. But if you understand construction, if you know how foundations are poured, how industrial subflooring is anchored, and how quiet suburban neighborhood is engineered from the ground up, you realize that the most secure vault in the world is the one no one would ever dare to tear apart. Special Agent Vance leaned forward, his hands flat against the cold metal, his eyes boring into Arthur's face. The commercial storage locker on the industrial strip off Route 42, Arthur. That's where you moved her, isn't it? After the initial search parties cleared out in December 2001, you went back. Arthur let out a low, dry chuckle that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. Storage lockers are too temporary, Agent Vance. Too many curious landlords, too many routine inspections, too many sniffing 9 units passing down concrete corridors during random sweeps. No, I didn't hide her in a storage locker. I kept her much closer to home. In fact, she never really left Elm Tree Lane at all. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the interrogation room. Chief Carter's breath caught in her throat. She stared at Arthur, her mind instantly racing back to the geography of the neighborhood, mapping the houses, the driveways, the yards, and the extensive renovation work Arthur had personally executed on his own property during the spring of 2002, just months after Sarah vanished. You built an addition, Carter said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. The workshop extension on the back of your garage. You poured a fresh reinforced concrete slab in May 2002. Arthur beamed, nodding slowly as if receiving praise for a brilliantly executed architectural design. Precision timing and heavy aggregate concrete mixed with industrial steel mesh. When you pour a 12-inch reinforced slab directly over a subterranean dry well lined with industrial polymer sheeting, nothing escapes. No gases, no organic breakdown, no moisture seepage, and certainly no scent for police dogs to pick up. For 25 years, while the town held candlelight vigils and plastered her face on yellowed missing person flyers, Sarah was resting peacefully less than 50 feet from my back porch, sealed beneath the very foundation where I stored my carpentry tools. The logistical horror of Arthur's revelation sent an immediate shockwave through the investigative hierarchy. Within 2 hours of the interrogation segment concluding, an emergency judicial search warrant was signed by Richland County Superior Court Judge Marcus Vance, authorizing the immediate deployment of a specialized state forensic excavation team to Arthur Miller's residential property on Elm Tree Lane. By mid-afternoon, the quiet, picturesque suburban street was once again transformed into a high-security crime zone. Yellow police tape cordoned off the entire block, heavy media vans choked the intersection, and specialized subterranean radar units rolled up Arthur's concrete driveway, their high-frequency ground-penetrating arrays aimed directly at the rear workshop extension of the garage. Dr. Eris Thorne, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, directed the meticulous, archaeological dismantling of the workshop floor. There were no sledgehammers swung in frustration or chaotic jackhammering that could risk compromising underlying fragile evidence. Instead, diamond-tipped core drills sliced through the thick, 25-year-old concrete slab with surgical precision, extracting cylindrical core samples while industrial vacuum systems extracted dust and debris in real time. Neighborhood residents stood behind the police barricades in stunned silence, watching in absolute disbelief as heavy excavation equipment peeled back the concrete layers of a house they had walked past every single day for decades, utterly oblivious to the dark secret buried just beneath the surface. As dusk settled over Mansfield, casting a cold, bruised purple hue across the autumn sky, Dr. Thorne's team breached the subterranean dry well beneath the reinforced concrete foundation. Heavy industrial floodlights were angled down into the dark cavity, casting a blinding white glare into the damp, subterranean space. Down inside the vault, wrapped in layers of heavy-duty industrial vapor barrier sheeting and secured with corrosion-resistant steel cable ties, lay the physical remains of Sarah Henderson, preserved in a macabre state of arrested decay by the airtight, chemically treated environment Arthur had meticulously engineered back in the spring of 2002. Chief Carter stood at the edge of the excavation pit, staring down into the dark vault as state troopers carefully prepared to recover the remains. The 25-year cold case was officially broken, but the psychological weight of the discovery hung heavy over the entire community of Mansfield. The monster hadn't come from the dark woods or the open highway. He had lived 3 houses down, shared coffee with grieving neighbors, and poured concrete over his crimes while smiling at the police officers who stood guard on his very street. The damp subterranean air of the excavated vault beneath Arthur Miller's garage felt thick with a spectral stillness, heavy with the trapped odors of aged polymer, dry soil, and decades of absolute silence. It was late evening on November 19, 2026, and the glare of heavy industrial floodlights cut violently through the darkness, illuminating the grim reality that had remained hidden just feet beneath the surface of Elm Tree Lane for a quarter of a century. Dr. Eris Thorne, kneeling inside the concrete-lined cavity with gloved hands and meticulous precision, began the slow, delicate process of documenting the industrial vapor barrier wrapping the remains of Sarah Henderson. Every movement was recorded on high-definition video, every centimeter of the surrounding soil mapped via 3D spatial laser scanners to preserve the absolute integrity of the crime scene for the upcoming capital trial. Upstairs, inside the warm confines of the makeshift command post established in the adjacent neighbor's living room, Chief Evelyn Carter watched the live feed on a ruggedized monitor. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, charged with the grim satisfaction of a hunt concluded, yet shadowed by the horrifying realization of how close Arthur Miller had come to taking his secret entirely to the grave. For 25 years, the town of Mansfield had spun its wheels in the mud of speculation, chasing phantom vehicles and transient predators, completely blind to the fact that the architect of their collective trauma was sitting 3 houses down, tending to his garden, and offering condolences to Sarah's grieving family members. Special Agent Thomas Vance stepped into the command post, shaking the autumn chill from his shoulders, holding a thick stack of newly recovered financial ledgers and personal journals seized from Arthur's home office during the secondary sweep. "We've finished auditing his private records from late 2001 and early 2002, Vance said, his voice clipped and tight as he dropped the files onto the coffee table. "It wasn't just a spontaneous crime of opportunity, Evelyn. The architectural drawings for this garage extension were drafted in December 2001, less than a month after Sarah vanished. He didn't just build a workshop. He engineered a permanent sepulcher with explicit structural calculations to ensure that no ground-penetrating radar or canine unit from that era could ever detect the void beneath the slab." The depth of Arthur's premeditation sent a shudder through the room. This was not the act of a panicked amateur losing control in a moment of passion. It was the calculated work of a cold, methodical predator who viewed human life as disposable and community trust as nothing more than a convenient camouflage. In the interrogation room downtown, Arthur continued to sit in unbroken stillness, refusing legal counsel, offering no emotional apologies, and speaking of his actions with the clinical detachment of an engineer describing a completed construction project. When detectives pressed him on why he chose Sarah Henderson, Arthur's response was chillingly banal. People think serial killers or kidnappers have grand, complex motives rooted in Hollywood drama. Arthur had told Agent Vance earlier that afternoon, his pale blue eyes fixed unblinkingly on the investigator. They look for grand psychological breaks, childhood traumas, or cinematic vendettas. But the truth is much simpler, much more mundane. Sarah lived alone. She maintained a predictable schedule, and she made the fatal mistake of trusting the quiet man who lived 3 houses down. Proximity breeds complacency, and complacency is an open invitation. As forensic technicians carefully hoisted the wrapped remains out of the subterranean vault and transferred them into the custody of the county coroner's office, the neighborhood of Elm Tree Lane stood pressed against the yellow police barricades in stunned, grieving silence. Decades of false hope, annual candlelight vigils, and unanswered prayers crystallized into a hard, aching reality. The monster hadn't slipped away into the night or vanished across state lines. He had mowed his lawn beneath their very eyes, shared neighborhood barbecues, and played the grieving neighbor while hiding a horrific secret beneath 10 inches of steel-reinforced concrete. The investigation now shifted from a search for a missing person to the painstaking task of building an unassailable capital murder prosecution. Every piece of physical evidence recovered from the subterranean vault, the degraded clothing, the binding materials, the polymer sheeting, and the concrete core samples, was cataloged and secured in tamper-proof transport containers bound for the state crime laboratory. Chief Carter walked out of the command post and stood on the dew-soaked grass of the front lawn, looking down the quiet, tree-lined street toward Arthur Miller's house. The front porch light was off, the windows were dark, and the yellow crime scene tape fluttered gently in the midnight breeze. The 25-year cold case was finally broken, but the shadow cast over Mansfield would remain indelible, a permanent reminder that the greatest dangers often wear the most familiar faces. The heavy steel doors of the Richland County Courthouse slammed shut against the biting morning frost of late November 2026, echoing across the limestone steps where media crews from across the Midwest had set up their broadcast towers. Inside the subterranean holding facility, Arthur Miller sat in a concrete holding cell, his posture entirely unslumped, his hands resting on his knees with the quiet discipline of a man who viewed his current confinement not as a defeat, but as a temporary administrative delay in a lifelong game of control. Down the hall, in the primary conference room of the district attorney's office, lead prosecutor Marcus Vance reviewed the expanding portfolio of physical and digital evidence that was rapidly transforming the single-count murder charge into a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional investigation of historic proportions. The excavation of the subterranean dry well beneath Arthur's garage had yielded far more than the preserved remains of Sarah Henderson. As forensic anthropologists from the State University meticulously sifted through the damp soil and secondary chambers adjacent to the main vault, They uncovered a hidden cache of personal belongings that had belonged to individuals who had vanished from neighboring counties across northern Ohio between 1985 and 1998. Unsolved missing persons files that local police departments had long ago written off as transient runaways or voluntary desertions. There were driver's licenses tucked inside corroded metal tins, engraved jewelry pieces wrapped in oilcloth, and monogrammed leather handbags that had survived decades of subterranean dampness thanks to the chemical seal of the vault. Chief Evelyn Carter walked into the conference room, dropping a thick sheaf of historical construction permits and regional business ledgers onto the laminate table beside the evidence binders. "We've finished auditing Arthur's commercial contracting records from the late 1980s through the turn of the century," Carter said, her voice tight with professional exhaustion and cold anger. He didn't just operate locally in Mansfield, Thomas. As a traveling subcontractor specializing in industrial foundations and agricultural silos, Arthur had unrestricted access to dozens of commercial properties, rural farmsteads, and municipal construction sites across 4 different counties. Everywhere he poured concrete, local police departments logged mysterious disappearances that were never linked together because the jurisdictions refused to share cross-border case files. The sheer scale of Arthur's predatory reach sent a chilling ripple through the investigative team. For decades, law enforcement agencies had operated within strict geographic silos, treating missing persons reports as isolated local anomalies rather than interconnected patterns of predatory behavior. Arthur had exploited those bureaucratic blind spots with surgical precision, using his professional mobility as a contractor to scout victims, execute abductions under the cover of routine work schedules, and utilize his access to heavy construction equipment to bury his crimes beneath miles of industrial concrete across the Rust Belt. Special Agent Thomas Vance leaned over the map spread across the table, his finger tracing a network of red pushpins that spanned from Mansfield down toward Columbus and westward toward the Indiana state line. He wasn't just a neighborhood predator who got lucky once in 2001, Vance said, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the timeline. Sarah Henderson wasn't his first victim. She was simply the one who lived long enough in his immediate proximity for a pattern to become visible when technology finally caught up with his forensic footprint. We are looking at a serial predator who operated in plain sight for nearly 20 years, protected by his unassuming demeanor, his local civic standing, and the fragmented nature of rural law enforcement archives. As the morning briefing progressed, District Attorney Marcus Vance outlined the legal strategy for the upcoming grand jury indictments. The discovery of the secondary artifacts in the vault meant that the state could now pursue multiple counts of aggravated capital murder, kidnapping, and desecration of human remains, effectively closing off any possibility of a plea bargain or a negotiated sentence. Arthur Miller was facing the absolute maximum penalty under Ohio state law, a legal reckoning that would ensure he spent the remainder of his natural life behind the very bars he had so arrogantly believed he could elude. Yet, despite the overwhelming mountain of physical evidence, genomic matches, and recovered personal effects, Arthur remained completely defiant during his brief, mandatory arraignment hearing later that afternoon. Clad in a standard orange correctional jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, he stepped into the crowded courtroom with a steady, unhurried stride. When Judge Marcus Vance formally read the expanded list of capital charges, detailing not only the abduction and murder of Sarah Henderson in November 2001, but the newly uncovered cold cases spanning back 3 decades, Arthur did not lower his head, nor did he consult with the court-appointed defense counsel standing anxiously beside him. Instead, Arthur looked directly up from the defense table toward the gallery, where Sarah Henderson's surviving sister sat clutching a framed photograph of her lost sibling. A cold, thin smile touched the corners of Arthur's mouth, a fleeting, arrogant expression of psychological dominance that proved, even in chains, inside a packed courtroom surrounded by armed bailiffs and federal investigators, the predator still believed he held the narrative in his hands. But the courtroom doors were locked, the evidence vaults were sealed with unassailable forensic proof, and the quarter-century illusion of safety that Arthur Miller had built upon a foundation of concrete and lies had finally, irrevocably collapsed. The fluorescent lights of the Richland County Detention Facility hummed with an incessant, sterile vibration on that freezing Monday morning in December 2026. Inside Interview Room B, the air was thick with the scent of cheap industrial cleaner and stale black coffee. Arthur Miller sat across the steel table from Special Agent Thomas Vance, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame, his hands cuffed to the bolted loop at the center of the laminate surface. There was no pretense left of the friendly neighbor who used to wave from his front porch on Elm Tree Lane. The mask had completely dissolved, replaced by a chilling, clinical stillness. Arthur's pale blue eyes locked onto Vance with an unnerving intensity, as if he were studying a specimen under a microscope rather than facing a stack of capital murder indictments that spanned 3 decades. "You really think a courtroom full of lawyers and jurors can comprehend the mechanics of what I built, Agent Vance?" Arthur asked, his voice smooth and conversational, devoid of any tremor or anxiety. He slowly rubbed his steel-cuffed wrists together, the metal scraping against the table with a sharp, metallic hiss. They look at a concrete slab and they see a floor. They look at a storage locker and they see a box. They don't understand infrastructure. They don't understand how a society is built on concealment. Every single road you drive on, every single bridge you cross, every single foundation poured across the state rests on things people prefer not to look at. I was simply an architect of the things people chose to forget. Agent Vance leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold steel, his gaze unblinking. "You weren't an architect, Arthur. You were a coward hiding behind a contractor's license because you lacked the courage to live in a world where you couldn't control every variable. But the illusion is over. The subterranean vault beneath your garage is empty, the remains are in the state coroner's office, and your DNA is locked into every single count of aggravated murder we're bringing to trial." Arthur let out a low, dry chuckle that echoed off the cinderblock walls. "DNA," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were a bitter vintage. "You treat DNA like a magical incantation that erases 30 years of history. You found a teacup on a table in 2001 and waited a quarter of a century for your machines to catch up. But science doesn't change what happened in that room, Agent Vance. It just puts a neat little label on a box that was already buried." While Arthur sat in his cell attempting to intellectualize his decades of predation, the investigative teams operating across northern Ohio were unearthing physical evidence that systematically dismantled every layer of his defense. In a secondary storage facility in Columbus, state forensic auditors executed a search warrant on a series of locked commercial containers that Arthur had rented under a dummy corporation back in the late 1990s. Inside the metal units, investigators discovered an exhaustive, meticulously organized archive of horror, hand-drawn maps of rural construction sites, detailed journals chronicling target surveillance schedules, and a collection of personal identification cards belonging to individuals reported missing between 1987 and 1998. The journals were written in a dense, precise architectural shorthand. Arthur had not merely abducted and murdered his victims on impulse. He had cataloged them like inventory, noting the exact dates of their disappearances, the weather conditions during the abductions, and the specific structural composition of the foundations beneath which their remains had been secreted. It was the blueprint of an unapprehended serial predator operating in plain sight, protected by the administrative blind spots of fragmented local police jurisdictions that rarely communicated across county lines. Chief Evelyn Carter reviewed the recovered journals in her office late that night, the amber glow of her desk lamp illuminating pages filled with chillingly mundane details interspersed with accounts of absolute brutality. The entries confirmed what the task force had long suspected. Sarah Henderson was not an isolated anomaly, nor was she the unfortunate victim of a random crime of opportunity. She had been targeted because her home was 3 houses down, because her schedule was predictable, and because Arthur believed his suburban camouflage was entirely impenetrable. "He treated human lives like building materials," Carter muttered to herself, turning a page covered in neat drafting diagrams of a rural barn foundation in Ashland County. Something to be measured, cut, shaped, and permanently embedded beneath the surface, so no one would ever question what was holding up the structure. The psychological impact of the unfolding revelations rippled far beyond the police department and the state crime laboratory. In the neighborhoods of Mansfield, the realization that a prolific monster had lived among them for 25 years sent a profound wave of collective shock and introspection. Residents who had known Arthur Miller for decades, who had hired him to pour concrete patios, fix their fences, or accepted his help with household repairs, struggled to reconcile the smiling, helpful neighbor of their memories with the cold-blooded architect of a subterranean charnel house. Elm Tree Lane became a ghost street, its houses draped in the heavy psychological shadow of a betrayal so absolute it felt structural. Back in the detention facility, Arthur's defense attorneys filed an emergency motion to suppress the physical evidence recovered from the subterranean vault, arguing that the 2002 construction permits and subsequent property additions did not constitute probable cause for an invasive exploratory excavation 24 years later. But District Attorney Marcus Vance was already preparing an unassailable legal brief anchored in the newly enacted legacy crime statutes and the undeniable genomic matches extracted from the historic evidence lockers. The legal battle lines were drawn, and the trial was hurtling toward a historic reckoning that would strip away every last defense Arthur Miller attempted to construct. The gray light of mid-December 2026 filtered through the frosted, wire-reinforced glass of the Richland County Superior Court, casting long, stark shadows across the polished oak paneling of the courtroom. Outside, a biting winter wind whipped snow across the courthouse steps, where international media vans idled with their satellite dishes aimed toward the frozen sky. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The preliminary motion hearings for the state of Ohio versus Arthur Miller were underway, and District Attorney Marcus Vance was systematically dismantling every procedural objection raised by the defense counsel. The legal battle had shifted from a local missing persons inquiry into a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional capital murder prosecution that would redefine modern cold case jurisprudence across the entire Midwest. Arthur Miller sat at the defense table, wearing a crisp white dress shirt and dark trousers, his hands resting quietly on the laminate surface. He did not look like an aging retiree caught in the machinery of justice. He projected an eerie, detached calm, occasionally leaning over to whisper a brief, calculated instruction to his lead defense attorney, public defender Julian Vance, no relation to the prosecutor, whose expression was tight with visible strain. The defense's primary strategy hinged on a narrow legal technicality, attempting to suppress the physical evidence recovered from the subterranean vault beneath Arthur's garage. They argued that the 2002 construction permits and the subsequent property additions did not constitute sufficient, contemporaneous probable cause for an invasive exploratory excavation 24 years after the initial 2001 investigation had been officially closed. District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped up to the mahogany podium, adjusting his microphone with deliberate slowness before addressing Judge Sarah Sterling on the bench. He didn't raise his voice or rely on theatrical rhetoric. Instead, he presented an unassailable matrix of scientific certainty and procedural continuity. "Your Honor," Vance began, his voice cutting cleanly through the silent courtroom, "the defense would have this court believe that the passage of time creates a protective barrier for a criminal, that if a predator is patient enough, clever enough, and cold enough to conceal his victims beneath layers of industrial concrete, the law loses its jurisdiction once the calendar turns a few decades. But the state's evidence does not rely on fading memories or subjective witness testimony. It relies on unalterable physical science and the unwavering continuity of the evidence locker." Vance gestured toward the large display monitor beside the jury box, which lit up with high-resolution digital scans of the original 2001 evidence log. The touch DNA profile recovered from the rim of the half-empty teacup in Sarah Henderson's living room was preserved under strict chain-of-custody protocols for 25 years. When modern short tandem repeat profiling and magnetic particle extraction were applied, it yielded an exact, zero-error match to Arthur Miller. That match is not a theory, Your Honor. It is an immutable biological signature that places the defendant inside the victim's home at the precise window of her disappearance. Furthermore, the architectural journals and structural blueprints seized from Arthur Miller's commercial storage units demonstrate active, premeditated concealment, a continuous act of obstruction that began the moment he poured that 12-inch reinforced concrete slab over the subterranean dry well in May 2002. For 45 minutes, Vance methodically dismantled the defense's suppression motion, walking the judge through the microecological soil samples, the chemical sealant integrity tests conducted by Dr. Eris Thorne, and the recovered personal identification cards belonging to historical missing persons from neighboring counties. Every legal argument raised by the defense was systematically neutralized by hard, physical data that left no room for judicial ambiguity. When Judge Sterling finally delivered her oral ruling from the bench late that afternoon, her words were crisp and definitive. The motion to suppress the physical evidence recovered from the residential property and commercial storage units is hereby denied in its entirety, she declared, her gavel striking the wooden block with a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot through the courtroom. The court finds that the evolution of forensic science does not invalidate the legality of an ongoing investigation, and the continuous concealment of human remains constitutes an active, ongoing obstruction of justice that supersedes standard temporal limitations. The trial will proceed as scheduled. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Arthur Miller did not flinch, nor did he display a single flicker of frustration or surprise. He simply maintained his upright posture, his pale blue eyes staring straight ahead at the bench as his defense attorney slumped back into his chair, visibly overwhelmed by the relentless momentum of the prosecution's case. Later that evening, as the courthouse cleared and the snow continued to blanket the streets of Mansfield, Chief Evelyn Carter and Special Agent Thomas Vance met in the command office of the police division to review the final witness lists and expert testimony schedules for the upcoming jury selection. The air in the room was heavy with the exhaustion of a grueling investigation, but it was matched by an undeniable sense of historic momentum. He thought he had engineered the perfect crime, Carter said, tossing a thick binder onto the desk. He believed that if he hid the bodies deep enough, covered them in enough concrete, and played the friendly neighbor long enough, the world would eventually forget that Sarah Henderson ever walked down Elm Tree Lane. Vance nodded, leaning back in his chair and staring at the wall map covered in red pushpins marking the decades-old missing persons cases tied to Arthur's contracting routes. Monsters like Arthur rely entirely on the institutional laziness of the past, Vance replied quietly. They count on police departments closing files too quickly, on jurisdictions refusing to share data across county lines, and on society's willingness to accept comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. But the past isn't a graveyard anymore, Evelyn. It's an open book. With the evidentiary suppression motions soundly defeated and the legal foundation securely locked in place, the stage was set for the trial of the century in Richland County, a legal reckoning that would strip away the final layers of suburban camouflage from a predator who had operated in plain sight for a quarter of a century, bringing absolute, blinding illumination to the darkest cold case in Ohio history. The bitter frost of January 2027 clung tightly to the iron-framed windows of the Richland County Superior Court, casting pale, geometric shafts of winter light across the polished oak gallery. Inside, the courtroom was packed to absolute capacity, every seat filled with local residents, national journalists, and surviving family members of the victims whose decades-old disappearances had been unmasked by the investigation. The air inside the chamber hummed with a tense, breathless stillness as Judge Sarah Sterling took her seat on the bench, her gavel coming down with a sharp, echoing crack that signaled the formal commencement of the trial of the state versus Arthur Miller. District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped forward to deliver the opening statement for the prosecution. Dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, his expression grave and unyielding, Vance walked slowly toward the jury box, his eyes sweeping across the 12 men and women chosen to weigh the evidence. He did not rely on theatrical shouting or exaggerated gestures. His voice was calm, rhythmic, and devastatingly precise. For 25 years, Vance began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent courtroom, the community of Mansfield lived under a quiet, unspoken shadow. A young woman named Sarah Henderson walked down Elm Tree Lane on a rainy November evening in 2001, stepped into her home, and vanished from the face of the earth as if she had never existed at all. For a quarter of a century, her family searched for answers in the empty wind, while neighbors whispered about phantom strangers, transient predators, and cars passing through the dark on lonely highways. Vance paused, turning his body slowly so that his gaze locked onto the defense table where Arthur Miller sat upright, dressed in a dark blazer and white shirt, his hands folded neatly over a yellow legal pad. The horror of this case, Vance continued, his tone hardening into steel, is not that Sarah Henderson was hunted by a stranger in the dark. It is that her killer was the man who waved from his front porch. It was the friendly neighbor who mowed his lawn, brought in trash cans, and stood on the wet pavement offering coffee to freezing police officers while hiding a monstrous secret just 50 feet from his back door. Arthur Miller did not hide his crimes in the deep woods or across state lines. He built his crimes right beneath our feet, locking them away beneath reinforced concrete, industrial polymer, and decades of calculated, remorseless deception. The prosecution's presentation of evidence over the following 2 weeks unfolded like a masterclass in modern forensic science and investigative persistence. Dr. Eris Thorne took the stand as an expert witness, guiding the jury through the meticulous, millimeter-by-millimeter excavation of the subterranean dry well beneath Arthur's garage. Through high-resolution 3D spatial models, microecological soil analysis, and chemical sealant integrity tests, Dr. Thorne demonstrated how Arthur had engineered a permanent, airtight sepulcher designed to withstand the test of time and elude any detection technology available at the turn of the century. When the physical evidence was presented, the degraded clothing, the binding materials, the industrial vapor barrier sheeting, and the core samples extracted from the concrete slab, the courtroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Jurors leaned forward, staring intently at the digital displays as the prosecution mapped out the unbroken chain of custody that connected the microscopic touch DNA on the chamomile teacup from November 2001 directly to the genetic profile of the defendant sitting 20 feet away. The defense, led by public defender Julian Vance, attempted to mount a strategy centered on reasonable doubt regarding the exact timeline of concealment and questioning the continuous custody chain of historical evidence lockers across multiple county jurisdictions. But their arguments repeatedly dissolved under the relentless weight of the state's forensic data. When cross-examined by the prosecution, the defense's expert witnesses were forced to concede that the genomic matches and the architectural blueprints seized from Arthur's commercial storage units pointed to a singular, undeniable conclusion: premeditated, active, and continuous concealment orchestrated by a single individual. Throughout the grueling days of testimony, Arthur Miller maintained his eerie, unblinking composure. He did not whisper anxiously to his attorneys, nor did he display anger or agitation when forensic photographs of the subterranean vault were displayed on the courtroom monitors. He simply watched the proceedings with the detached, clinical curiosity of an engineer evaluating a blueprint he had drawn decades prior, seemingly convinced to the very end that his intellectual superiority would ultimately shield him from the consequences of his actions. As the second week of the trial drew to a close, the state rested its case, having erected an unassailable mountain of physical, scientific, and circumstantial proof that left no room for legal ambiguity. The jury sat in stunned, reflective silence, absorbing the staggering scale of a predation that had spanned 30 years, hidden behind a facade of suburban normality. The illusion was completely shattered, and the final reckoning for the architect of Elm Tree Lane was fast approaching. The final week of January 2027 arrived with a relentless, freezing sleet that blanketed the city of Mansfield in a pale, icy glaze, sealing the Richland County Superior Court in a fortress of winter quiet. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was thick with the collective anticipation of a community standing on the precipice of historical closure. The defense had rested its case after a brief, 2-day presentation that failed to shake a single pillar of the state's forensic architecture, and now the trial had reached its most critical juncture, the closing arguments. District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped forward from the prosecution table, walking deliberately toward the jury box. He wore a dark charcoal suit, his expression grave and unyielding, his eyes sweeping across the 12 jurors who had sat through weeks of harrowing testimony anatomical evidence, and chilling architectural blueprints. When he began to speak, his voice was measured, resonant, and devoid of theatrical excess, cutting through the absolute silence of the courtroom like a sharp blade. For 25 years, Vance began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the gallery, the town of Mansfield lived inside a comfortable illusion. We told ourselves that evil wears a distinct face, that it arrives from the outside, driving an unmarked car along a lonely highway in the dead of night, looking for a victim to snatch and carry away into the shadows. We built our lives around that comforting myth because the alternative was simply too terrifying to contemplate. We wanted to believe that our neighbors were safe, that our streets were secure, and that a quiet man who mowed his lawn, brought in your trash cans, and offered coffee to freezing police officers could never be anything other than what he pretended to be. Vance turned slowly, pointing his hand toward the defense table where Arthur Miller sat upright, his expression a mask of chilling, impassive indifference. The evidence presented in this courtroom over the past 2 weeks has shattered that illusion forever, Vance continued, his tone hardening into steel. Arthur Miller did not hide his crimes in a distant forest or across state lines. He hid them in plain sight. He used proximity as his camouflage, community trust as a shield, and the foundational concrete of his own property as a permanent tomb. He watched Sarah Henderson walk down Elm Tree Lane on that rainy November evening in 2001, knowing precisely when her kettle would whistle, knowing precisely how close his own back door was, and believing with absolute arrogance that his intellectual superiority would outlast the march of time. The prosecutor walked back toward the center of the well, gesturing toward the large digital display screens that still displayed the 3D spatial models of the subterranean dry well beneath Arthur's garage. The defense has asked you to consider the passage of time as a form of absolution, Vance said, his eyes locking onto the jury. They have suggested that because 25 years have passed, because the files grew dusty in the basement archive, and because the physical evidence sat in an airtight box, the law should somehow lose its mandate. But time is not an ally of the criminal, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Time is merely a test of our persistence. And science caught up. The touch DNA on that half-empty teacup, preserved across a quarter of a century without degradation, spoke with an absolute, unalterable voice. The architectural journals seized from his commercial storage units mapped out a 30-year pattern of calculated predation. Arthur Miller is not an aging grandfather caught in a tragic misunderstanding. He is a methodical, remorseless architect of human destruction who believed he had engineered the perfect crime. When Vance stepped back to the prosecution table, public defender Julian Vance rose to deliver the closing statement for the defense. His posture was stiff, his voice strained as he attempted to mount a final, desperate challenge against the mountain of physical proof. He argued that the circumstantial nature of the historical missing persons files lacked direct eyewitness accounts of the abductions, that the chain of custody across multiple county jurisdictions over 3 decades left room for procedural error, and that the state had built a narrative designed to capitalize on public outrage rather than objective legal standards. Yet, even as he spoke, the lack of conviction in his own voice was painfully apparent. The defense was not arguing against facts. They were simply arguing against the inevitable. Following a brief, precise rebuttal by District Attorney Vance, Judge Sarah Sterling delivered her final instructions to the jury. She outlined the legal definitions of capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, and continuous concealment of human remains, emphasizing that the evaluation of physical evidence must be anchored strictly in the scientific data presented during the trial rather than emotion or speculation. At 3:15 p.m. on a bitterly cold Thursday afternoon, the bailiff escorted the 12 jurors out of the courtroom and into the private deliberation room. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing them inside with thousands of pages of trial transcripts, hundreds of forensic exhibits, and the weighty responsibility of rendering a verdict that would echo through the history of the American judicial system. As the hours dragged on, the courtroom gallery remained packed. No one left. Reporters, local residents, state investigators, and surviving family members of the victims sat in absolute stillness through the fading daylight. Outside, The freezing sleet continued to tap against the courthouse windows, while inside, the collective heartbeat of Mansfield seemed suspended in the amber glow of the overhead chandeliers. At 8:42 p.m., just over 5 hours of intense deliberation, a sharp buzzer sounded from the jury room. The bailiff stepped out, nodding tersely to Judge Sterling. The courtroom sprang into immediate, tense motion. Court officers took their positions. The media pool checked their broadcast feeds, and the defense counsel stood up as Arthur Miller was instructed to rise. Arthur did not display a single sign of panic. His movements were slow, deliberate, and chillingly controlled as he adjusted the cuffs of his white dress shirt and looked toward the jury box with his pale blue eyes wide and unblinking. Judge Sterling returned to the bench, her expression solemn as she received the manila envelope containing the verdict forms from the foreperson. She opened the papers, scanned the signatures with practiced calm, and handed them to the court clerk to read aloud into the record. The courtroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence, so absolute that the hum of the electric lighting seemed to roar. The clerk's voice rang out, clear and steady. In the matter of the state of Ohio versus Arthur Miller, on the first count of aggravated capital murder in the death of Sarah Henderson in November 2001, how do you find? The foreperson of the jury stood up, looking directly across the courtroom. We find the defendant, Arthur Miller, guilty. A collective, audible gasp swept through the gallery, instantly hushed by a sharp glance from the judge. The clerk continued down the list, reading through the subsequent capital murder counts, kidnapping charges, and counts of continuous concealment spanning 3 decades. Guilty.
Guilty.
Guilty. On every single count, across every single indictment, the verdict was unanimous. 25 years of silence, 25 years of hidden vaults, and 25 years of suburban deception were officially dismantled in less than 30 seconds. Arthur Miller did not flinch. He did not drop his head, nor did he look toward the gallery where the families of his victims sat weeping in silent vindication. He simply stood tall at the defense table, his hands resting lightly on the wooden surface, maintaining his icy, defiant composure to the very end. Judge Sterling formally accepted the verdict, revoked all bonds, and scheduled the formal sentencing phase for the following month, knowing that under Ohio state law, the only possible outcome for a serial predator convicted of multiple counts of capital murder under the newly enforced legacy statutes was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As armed bailiffs stepped forward, placing cold steel handcuffs around Arthur Miller's wrists and guiding him away through the secure rear exit of the courtroom, the 25-year cold case of Elm Tree Lane reached its definitive, unassailable judicial conclusion. The illusion was gone. The subterranean vaults were empty, and the dark shadow that had suffocated Mansfield for a quarter of a century was finally replaced by the blinding, permanent light of absolute justice. The slate-gray skies of early February 2027 finally broke over northern Ohio, casting a cold, brilliant winter sunlight across the limestone facade of the Richland County Courthouse. Inside the grand courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with a solemn, historic gravity. The final chapter of a 25-year nightmare had arrived. There were no more suppression motions to argue, no more forensic blueprints to analyze, and no more procedural technicalities for the defense to exploit. The jury had spoken with unanimous, unshakable clarity, and today Judge Sarah Sterling would formally deliver the sentence that would lock Arthur Miller away from the world he had manipulated for decades. Long before the mahogany doors opened to the public, the hallways outside the courtroom were packed to absolute capacity. Local residents, national media correspondents, state forensic investigators, and surviving family members of the victims stood shoulder to shoulder in tense, reverent silence. For the families of the women whose lives were stolen and buried beneath 12 inches of reinforced concrete, this day represented the culmination of a quarter-century spent living in a state of agonizing limbo, a perpetual vacuum of unanswered questions and phantom grief. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff's sharp voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sarah Sterling." The courtroom stood as one as Judge Sterling entered, her expression grave and composed. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room before giving the signal for the defendant to be brought in. A moment later, the secure side door opened, and Arthur Miller was escorted into the well of the court by 2 armed bailiffs. He wore a standard orange correctional jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled in heavy steel chains that clanked rhythmically against the floor with every measured step. Yet, despite the undeniable reality of his conviction, Arthur's posture remained unnervingly upright. His pale blue eyes scanned the packed gallery with an eerie, detached indifference, utterly devoid of remorse, contrition, or fear. Before handing down the final sentencing, Judge Sterling invited the victims' impact statements into the record. One by one, family members approached the podium, their voices trembling with a mixture of profound sorrow and hard-won liberation. Sarah Henderson's younger sister, now a woman in her 40s with graying hair and eyes etched with decades of sleepless nights, placed a framed photograph of Sarah on the wooden ledge before speaking. "For 25 years, I lived with a phantom," she began, her voice steadying as she looked directly across the room toward Arthur Miller. "Every time I walked down Elm Tree Lane, every time I celebrated a holiday, every time I looked at an empty chair at our family dinner table, I wondered where you were, Sarah. We spent a quarter of a century searching for clues in the wind, wondering if you had left us, wondering if you were suffering. And all the while, the monster who took you was standing 3 houses down, tending to his garden, mowing his lawn, and offering us false sympathy. You thought you could erase her, Arthur. You thought that if you built your subterranean vault deep enough and covered it in enough concrete, the world would forget her name. But you were wrong. Sarah's voice outlived your silence. And today, your world ends." Arthur did not blink. He did not look down at the photograph, nor did he flinch at the condemnation ringing through the courtroom. He simply stared ahead with the cold detachment of an architect listening to a routine administrative review. When the impact statements concluded, District Attorney Marcus Vance stood up to deliver the state's final recommendation. He walked slowly to the podium, his hands resting lightly on the wood, his gaze fixed upon the bench. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice echoing cleanly through the silent chamber, "the evidence uncovered in this case revealed a level of calculated, predatory depravity that defies ordinary human comprehension. Arthur Miller did not merely commit a series of murders. He constructed an industrial infrastructure of concealment, using his professional standing, his community camouflage, and his knowledge of construction to extinguish human lives and bury them beneath the very foundations of his life. For 30 years, he operated as an unapprehended serial predator, protected by the administrative blind spots of the past. But science caught up, the law caught up, and the unalterable truth has finally been brought to light. The state respectfully requests that the court impose the maximum statutory penalty permitted under the law on every single count, with no possibility of parole, ensuring that the defendant spends the remainder of his natural life behind bars where he can never again threaten the safety of any community." Judge Sterling nodded slowly, turning her attention from the prosecutor to the defense table. She asked Arthur Miller if he wished to address the court before sentence was pronounced. Arthur slowly stood up, the heavy steel shackles clinking against his ankles. He adjusted the collar of his jumpsuit, looked briefly toward his defense attorney, and then turned his gaze directly toward the judge's bench. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, even, and conversational, carrying an eerie, intellectual arrogance that sent a chill through the gallery. "Your Honor, the prosecution has spent weeks constructing a grand narrative about monsters and morality," Arthur began, his tone remarkably casual, as if he were delivering a lecture at a technical seminar rather than standing before a judge for capital sentencing. "They talk about concrete and DNA as if science is some sort of moral crusader. But science is just a measurement of physical reality. What I built on Elm Tree Lane was an engineering solution to a transient problem. People look at history through the lens of emotion, sentimentality, and manufactured outrage. They want villains and heroes because it makes them feel safe in a chaotic world. But the truth is far more mechanical. Every structure has a foundation, and every foundation eventually settles. You can lock me away in a cage, you can throw away the key, and this courtroom can applaud itself for achieving justice. But you cannot change the mechanics of what was built, and you cannot rewrite the engineering of the past. Arthur paused, offering a faint, chilling smile before sitting back down with absolute composure. Judge Sterling looked down at him, her expression hardening into absolute, unyielding resolve. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a razor, "you speak of engineering, structure, and foundations. But you fundamentally misunderstood the most basic principle of human society, that justice is not built on concrete and steel. It is built on truth, memory, and the unalterable value of human life. You believed your subterranean walls could hide your crimes forever, but you underestimated the enduring power of human persistence. You built your life on a foundation of lies, and today, that foundation finally collapses." The judge reached forward, picking up her pen and turning to the official sentencing documents. On the first count of aggravated capital murder in the death of Sarah Henderson, in the year 2001, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Judge Sterling declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. On the subsequent counts of aggravated capital murder, kidnapping, and continuous concealment of human remains spanning multiple jurisdictions, this court sentences you to consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on every single charge. May God have mercy on your soul. With a sharp, resounding crack, Judge Sterling brought her gavel down upon the wooden block. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, sealing the judgment for eternity. The bailiffs immediately stepped forward, placing firm hands on Arthur Miller's shoulders and lifting him from his chair. As the heavy steel handcuffs were secured tightly around his wrists, Arthur offered one final, fleeting glance toward the gallery before he was guided away through the secure rear exit, disappearing down the corridor toward the subterranean transport vans that would take him away from Mansfield forever. Outside the Richland County Courthouse, the heavy sleet had finally cleared, and brilliant winter sunlight reflected off the melting snow on the limestone steps. Chief Evelyn Carter and Special Agent Thomas Vance stood together on the plaza, watching the international media vans pack their equipment away as the historic crowd slowly began to disperse. The air was crisp, clean, and quiet. "It's over, Evelyn," Vance said quietly, pulling his heavy wool coat tight against the wind. "The vault is empty. The case files are closed, and Elm Tree Lane can finally breathe again." Carter looked down the long, historic street toward the horizon, where the distant line of trees marked the boundary of the neighborhood where it all began 25 years ago. "Monsters like Arthur rely on silence," Carter replied, her voice steady and resolute. "They count on us forgetting, on time washing away the evidence, and on people looking the other way. But as long as there are investigators willing to look back, and as long as science keeps marching forward, no secret can stay buried forever." The quarter-century cold case of Mansfield, Ohio, was officially resolved. The dark shadow that had suffocated a community for a generation was gone, replaced by the permanent, unassailable light of absolute justice. The quiet stillness of early spring 2027 finally settled over Elm Tree Lane, washing away the bitter chill of winter and the heavy, suffocating shadow that had gripped the neighborhood for a quarter of a century. The yellow police barricades that had choked the street for weeks were long gone. The media vans had packed up their broadcast towers, and the relentless flashbulbs of international journalists had faded into memory. Yet, for the residents of Mansfield, the transformation of the street was far more profound than the departure of the press. Number 412, Elm Tree Lane. The modest, unassuming single-story home where Arthur Miller had lived, tended to his garden, and harbored his monstrous secrets, stood completely vacant, its front windows boarded over with thick sheets of plywood, waiting for the county-ordered demolition crew that would soon raze the structure to the ground. Inside the Richland County Police Division, Chief Evelyn Carter stood before the large wall map in her private office, her hand tracing the network of red pushpins that had once mapped out Arthur's multi-county contracting routes and decades-old missing persons cases. One by one, those pins had been tagged, cross-referenced, and officially transitioned from active, unsolved cold cases into closed files of historical resolution. The agonizing limbo that had fractured families across northern Ohio for generations was finally replaced by the solemn, enduring peace of truth and accountability. Across town at the State Forensic Laboratory, Dr. Eris Thorne and his team were wrapping up the final comprehensive documentation of the evidence recovered from the subterranean vault beneath Arthur's garage. The physical artifacts, the degraded clothing, the binding materials, the industrial polymer sheeting, and the core samples extracted from the concrete slab had been permanently cataloged in secure, climate-controlled archival vaults, ensuring that the physical history of the investigation would remain intact for future generations of criminologists, forensic scientists, and legal scholars. The subterranean cavity itself, once an impenetrable sepulchre designed to outlast human memory, had been completely filled with industrial gravel and cement slurry, permanently erasing the physical void that had once hidden the darkest horrors of Mansfield's history. Special Agent Thomas Vance walked into Chief Carter's office, holding a thick, final administrative report summarizing the multi-jurisdictional task force's findings. He tossed the binder onto the wooden desk with a quiet, deliberate thud, letting out a deep breath of profound professional closure. "The federal and state audits are officially signed off," Vance said, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Every county police department touched by Arthur's contracting routes has adopted our new protocols for cross-border missing persons data sharing. The blind spots that allowed a predator to operate in plain sight for 30 years have been permanently illuminated." Carter nodded, looking down at the report before turning her gaze toward the window that overlooked the quiet, tree-lined streets of Mansfield. "We stopped a ghost, Thomas," Carter said softly, her voice carrying the quiet weight of a battle hard won. "For 25 years, people whispered about what happened to Sarah Henderson, convinced that she had vanished into thin air, or that evil only arrived from the outside in the dead of night. But the hardest truth we had to face, and the truth this community will carry forward, is that evil often looks like the person who helps you shovel your driveway, the neighbor who waves from his porch, and the quiet man who minds his own business. The real lesson of Elm Tree Lane isn't just that science caught up with a monster. It's that we can never afford to look away again." As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet neighborhoods of Mansfield, a small, gathering crowd formed quietly at the edge of the public park near Elm Tree Lane. There were no news cameras, no politicians, and no flashing lights. Only family members, surviving loved ones, local residents, and the investigators who had dedicated their lives to breaking the silence. At the center of the gathering stood a newly erected stone monument, bearing the names of Sarah Henderson and the other historical victims whose voices had been silenced for decades, but whose identities had finally been restored. At the base of the monument, fresh wildflowers rested on the polished granite surface, catching the gentle spring breeze. Sarah Henderson's younger sister stepped forward, placing her hand gently against the cold stone, tracing the engraved letters of her sister's name. The 25-year cold case was officially closed. The courtroom battles had ended, and the architect of Elm Tree Lane was locked away in a maximum security prison cell where his elaborate designs and subterranean vaults could never touch the world again. The shadow had finally lifted, and the community of Mansfield could finally breathe under the open, unobstructed light of day. The warm morning sunlight of late spring gently illuminated the quiet, tree-lined avenues of Mansfield, casting bright golden patterns across the freshly paved asphalt of Elm Tree Lane. Where number 412 once stood as a silent, foreboding monument to decades of hidden horror, there was now only a clean, open plot of green grass, the heavy demolition machinery having long since cleared away the boarded-up house and filled the subterranean cavity beneath the garage with solid, permanent earth. The yellow police tape, the media broadcast vans, and the heavy iron barricades were distant memories, replaced by the quiet, everyday rhythms of suburban life. Children walking home from the local elementary school, mail carriers delivering letters to front porches, and neighbors tending to their flower beds in the crisp morning air. Inside the Richland County Police Division, the atmosphere had transitioned from the frantic, high-stakes urgency of active manhunts and courtroom cross-examinations to a sustained, institutional dedication to vigilance. Chief Evelyn Carter sat at her desk, reviewing the final standardized operating procedures drafted by the multi-jurisdictional task force. The operational framework that had finally broken Arthur Miller's 30-year predatory cycle, mandating cross-border data sharing, automated forensic integration, and the mandatory reevaluation of historical missing persons files using modern DNA extraction techniques, was now being adopted by law enforcement agencies across the entire state of Ohio and shared with regional departments throughout the Midwest. Special Agent Thomas Vance stepped into her office, holding a thick, leather-bound archive ledger containing the permanent records of the Elm Tree Lane investigation. He set it gently onto the corner of the desk, his expression relaxed yet reflective. The State Attorney General's office just finalized the nationwide dissemination of our cold case protocol, Vance said, pulling up a chair opposite Carter. Every single regional precinct from Cleveland down to Cincinnati is now running historical missing persons databases through the updated short tandem repeat profiling systems. What happened here in Mansfield isn't just a local chapter closing anymore. It's becoming the national standard for how law enforcement hunts ghosts. Carter closed the administrative folder she was reading and looked up, a faint, weary smile touching the corners of her mouth. A ghost is all they ever seem to be, Thomas, she replied, her voice soft and steady. For 25 years, people believed that Sarah Henderson had vanished into thin air, that predators operated outside the boundaries of human society like phantoms in the dark. But Arthur Miller proved that the most dangerous monsters aren't hiding in the deep woods or driving cross-country highways. They are living right next door, mowing their lawns, drinking coffee on their porches, and banking on our collective willingness to look the other way when things don't quite add up. The legacy of the investigation extended far beyond departmental policy shifts and administrative protocols. Across the city, the community monument erected in the public park near Elm Tree Lane had become a quiet place of reflection and remembrance. Families from across northern Ohio, whose loved ones had been unmasked and identified during the exhaustive excavation of Arthur's historical storage units and commercial contracting sites, regularly visited the Granite Memorial. They brought fresh wildflowers, lit candles during quiet evening walks, and shared stories of lives cut tragically short by a predator who had exploited the administrative blind spots of a fragmented past. In the maximum security state correctional facility hundreds of miles away, Arthur Miller spent his days inside a stark, 12-by-8-foot segregation cell. The expansive architectural blueprints, the precision drafting tools, and the carefully engineered subterranean vaults of his past were entirely gone, replaced by solid steel bars, concrete walls, and the unyielding, unalterable routine of institutional confinement. Deprived of his professional standing, his suburban camouflage, and the protective illusion of his own intellectual superiority, Arthur sat in complete isolation. He refused to speak with visiting journalists, offered no further commentary to psychologists, and spent his hours staring blankly at the solid concrete wall opposite his bunk, a permanent prisoner of the very system of confinement he had spent a lifetime attempting to outsmart. Back in Mansfield, the spring breeze rustled through the young maple trees lining Elm Tree Lane, carrying the distant laughter of children playing in a nearby yard. The trauma that had suffocated the community for a generation had not magically vanished, nor had the aching scars left in the hearts of Sarah Henderson's surviving family members healed overnight. But the profound, paralyzing shadow of uncertainty had been permanently lifted. The vaults were sealed, the verdicts were rendered, and the dark chapter was firmly closed. Chief Carter walked out of her office, down the brightly lit corridor of the police division, and stepped out through the front glass doors into the warm morning light. She paused for a moment on the concrete steps, taking a deep breath of the crisp air, looking out over the peaceful streets of the town she had sworn to protect. The past could never be rewritten, and the ghosts of Elm Tree Lane would always remain a part of Mansfield's history, but the community was finally breathing under the open, unobstructed sky of absolute truth and enduring justice. The early summer heat of June 2027 settled over Mansfield like a warm, steady blanket, bathing the quiet residential streets in vibrant emerald greens and brilliant afternoon sunlight. On Elm Tree Lane, The open patch of green grass where number 412 once stood had begun to blend seamlessly into the neighborhood, the rich soil settling naturally as if nothing ever disrupted the peaceful equilibrium of the block. For the families who walked their dogs past the empty lot or waved to neighbors pulling out of their driveways, the physical erasure of the house had marked a turning point, not a forgetting of the past, but a reclamation of the present. The neighborhood was no longer defined by the monstrous secret hidden beneath its soil. It was defined by the resilience of those who refused to let the darkness have the final word. Inside the Richland County Courthouse, the administrative echoes of the Arthur Miller trial had finally quieted into the steady, methodical hum of daily judicial business. Yet, the systemic ripples of the prosecution's historic victory continued to resonate across state and federal law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest. In the primary conference room of the police division, Chief Evelyn Carter sat alongside Special Agent Thomas Vance, reviewing the preliminary impact data from the newly established Interstate Cold Case Clearinghouse. The protocol forged in the fires of the Mansfield investigation, integrating cross-border missing persons archives, automated short tandem repeat DNA profiling, and rigorous oversight of historical contracting records, had already led to the successful reopening and resolution of 3 separate cold cases in neighboring states. The ripple effect is real, Evelyn, Vance said, tapping a finger against the statistical summary report spread across the table. For decades, law enforcement agencies operated like isolated islands, protecting their own turf and letting cross-border investigations fall through the administrative cracks. Arthur exploited those very cracks for 30 years. But because of what we built here in Mansfield, because we refused to let a quarter-century of silence protect a predator, the entire paradigm of cold case investigation across the region has shifted. Detectives in other states now have the structural tools and the legal precedent to dig into their own historical files and find the truth. Carter leaned back in her chair, gazing out the large arched window toward the sunlit town square where residents sat on park benches beneath the shade of towering oak trees. It proves that legacy is defined by how we confront our darkest failures, Carter replied, her voice steady and reflective. We can't undo what happened to Sarah Henderson or the other victims whose lives were stolen in the shadows. We can't give their families back the decades they spent searching in the dark. But we can ensure that no future monster ever finds a safe harbor behind suburban camouflage and administrative laziness. We built a light that cannot be turned off. The emotional heart of that light remained anchored at the community memorial in the public park, just a few blocks away from Elm Tree Lane. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the park grounds, Sarah Henderson's younger sister walked slowly along the paved pathway toward the polished granite monument. She carried a small bundle of fresh white lilies, placing them gently at the base of the stone alongside the flickering candles left by other local residents. There was a quiet, profound grace in her expression, a deep sorrow that would always remain, but paired now with the enduring peace of absolute truth and unassailable justice. Miles away, inside the sterile, isolated confines of the maximum security state penitentiary, Arthur Miller sat alone in his 12-by-8-foot segregation cell. The fluorescent strip on the ceiling buzzed with an incessant, sterile hum, casting a harsh, white glare over the concrete walls and the solid steel bars of his door. The meticulous architectural blueprints, the precise drafting tools, and the elaborate mental calculations that had once sustained his arrogance were entirely gone, stripped away by the absolute permanence of his consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. He no longer received letters, he refused all visits from distant acquaintances, and his world had been reduced to the narrow expanse of a concrete floor and the unyielding cadence of prison guards passing his door. The architect who believed he had outsmarted history, who fancied himself a master of concealment and control, had become a prisoner of his own immutable ruin, completely forgotten by the outside world, left to contemplate the absolute failure of his subterranean empire in total silence. Back in Mansfield, the evening air grew cool and crisp as the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky above Elm Tree Lane. The street lamps clicked on in steady sequence, casting warm pools of yellow light across the sidewalks where children had finished playing for the day and front porches welcomed family members returning home from work. The shadow that had hung over the town for 25 long years was gone, replaced by the open, unobstructed sky of a community that had faced its worst nightmare, stared it down with unyielding courage, and emerged into the permanent light of truth, justice, and enduring peace. The golden light of high summer in July 2027 poured down over the rooftops of Mansfield, washing the streets in a radiant, unblemished warmth that felt symbolic of the town's profound psychological renewal. On Elm Tree Lane, the open patch of emerald green grass where number 412 had once stood was now dotted with wild clover and patches of morning glories, blending seamlessly into the neighborhood as nature gently reclaimed the ground. The heavy machinery, the police tape, and the relentless hum of media trucks were entirely gone, replaced by the tranquil sounds of neighborhood life. Lawnmowers humming in the distance, bicycle chains rattling as children raced down the pavement, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of families living openly, without the dark, unspoken weight that had suffocated their community for a generation. Inside the headquarters of the Richland County Police Division, Chief Evelyn Carter sat at her desk, organizing the final administrative binders that would permanently close the active case files of the Elm Tree Lane investigation. Across from her, Special Agent Thomas Vance was reviewing the latest quarterly statistics from the Interstate Cold Case Clearinghouse. The institutional framework forged during the Arthur Miller trial, the automated short tandem repeat DNA profiling systems, the mandatory cross-border data sharing protocols, and the rigorous oversight of historical contracting records, was no longer just an experimental model. It had become the gold standard adopted by law enforcement agencies across the entire Midwest and federal task forces nationwide. "We just received the annual performance metrics from the Regional Clearinghouse," Vance said, looking up from his tablet with a satisfied, measured expression. Since the conclusion of the Mansfield trial, over 40 historical missing persons cases across 4 neighboring states have been successfully reopened, reanalyzed, and linked to serial offenders who operated unchecked during the late 80s and 90s. The administrative blind spots that Arthur exploited for 30 years are being systematically dismantled. What started as a desperate search for Sarah Henderson has fundamentally transformed how modern law enforcement hunts predators who try to hide behind the passage of time. Carter nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window that framed the peaceful, sunlit town square outside. "Arthur believed he was operating on a higher plane of intelligence, Thomas," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet, resonant authority of a battle hard won. "He thought he could engineer a subterranean empire of concealment and outsmart human history with concrete and silence. But he forgot the most fundamental truth of human resilience, that memory does not die simply because a file gathers dust, and science will always catch up to those who try to outrun their own darkness. We couldn't bring Sarah back, and we couldn't erase the decades of agony her family endured, but we made sure that her name became a beacon that permanently illuminated the shadows." The enduring legacy of that illumination was enshrined just a few blocks away at the Public Park Memorial. There, beneath the shade of towering maples, the polished granite monument bearing the names of Sarah Henderson and the other historical victims stood as a permanent testament to truth and accountability. Throughout the warm July afternoons, local residents, visiting families, and young detectives from regional academies frequently stopped by to leave fresh flowers, read the inscriptions, and reflect upon the lessons of the past. The memorial was never a place of morbid fascination. It was a sanctuary of grace, reminding everyone who visited that justice is ultimately anchored in the unwavering courage of those who refuse to look away. Far away from the sunlit streets of Mansfield, deep within the subterranean secure housing unit of the maximum security state penitentiary, Arthur Miller existed in absolute, unrelenting isolation. The 12-by-8-foot segregation cell was bathed in the harsh, sterile glare of a recessed fluorescent ceiling fixture that hummed with a monotonous, maddening frequency. The precise drafting tools, The expansive architectural blueprints and the complex mental calculations that had once sustained his profound intellectual arrogance were entirely gone, stripped away by the unalterable permanence of consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Arthur sat on the edge of his steel-framed bunk, his orange correctional jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame, his pale blue eyes fixed unblinkingly on the solid concrete wall opposite his door. He received no letters, refused all requests for media interviews, and lived completely cut off from the outside world he had once manipulated with such cold precision. The architect who fancied himself a master of concealment and control had been utterly erased by the very system of justice he had mocked, reduced to a nameless, forgotten inmate spending his remaining years in total, inescapable silence. The elaborate subterranean vaults he had engineered to outlast time had become his philosophical tomb, a fitting, inescapable end for a predator who had built his entire existence on a foundation of lies. Back in Mansfield, the summer evening began to cool as a gentle breeze swept down Elm Tree Lane, rustling the leaves of the mature oak trees that canopied the street. The street lamps flickered on one by one in steady, automated sequence, casting warm pools of amber light across the clean sidewalks and welcoming front porches where neighbors sat together, talking quietly as the stars emerged in the vast, open sky above. The quarter-century nightmare that had held the community in its icy grip was fully, irrevocably resolved. The vaults were sealed, the verdicts were absolute, and the dark chapter was permanently closed. The shadow had lifted, leaving behind a community bathed in the unyielding, permanent light of truth, justice, and enduring peace. The late summer sunlight of August 2027 stretched in long, golden ribbons across the quiet neighborhoods of Mansfield, illuminating a city that had not only survived its darkest historical trauma, but had grown stronger, more vigilant, and deeply unified in its pursuit of absolute truth. On Elm Tree Lane, the open patch of emerald green grass where number 412 had once stood was now lush with clover and native wildflowers, completely integrated into the peaceful rhythm of the suburban block. For the families who walked their dogs past the lot each evening or waved to neighbors tending to their front gardens, the physical void had long ceased to be a symbol of horror. Instead, it stood as a quiet testament to a community that had faced its worst nightmare head-on, dismantled its foundations, and reclaimed its right to peace. Inside the Richland County Police Division, the operational tempo had settled into a disciplined, proactive routine. Chief Evelyn Carter sat at her desk reviewing the final quarterly audit from the Regional Interstate Cold Case Clearinghouse, a program born directly out of the exhaustive investigation into Arthur Miller's multi-decade crimes. Across from her, Special Agent Thomas Vance was cross-referencing a new batch of digitized historical records submitted by county sheriff departments across northern Ohio. The systemic reforms, automated short tandem repeat DNA profiling, cross-border data sharing protocols, and rigorous oversight of historical commercial contracting records were operating with clockwork precision, ensuring that no future predator could ever exploit administrative blind spots or regional silos again. The latest data from the State Attorney General's office confirms that our new protocol has directly contributed to the resolution of over 50 historical missing persons cases across the Midwest this year alone, Vance said, looking up from his tablet with a quiet, steady pride. Detectives in neighboring states are using the very same forensic frameworks we developed during the Elm Tree Lane investigation to bring closure to families who have spent decades waiting in the dark. Arthur spent a lifetime building walls to keep the truth buried, but his crimes inadvertently became the blueprint for a nationwide revolution in cold case jurisprudence. Carter nodded slowly, her gaze resting on the framed photograph of the public park memorial hanging on her office wall. He believed he was operating on a level of intellectual superiority that the rest of the world could never comprehend, Carter replied, her voice resonant and calm. He thought he could use concrete, polymer, and suburban camouflage to rewrite history and silence his victims forever. But he fundamentally misunderstood the human spirit. He didn't realize that memory outlives mortar, and that science will always catch up to darkness. We couldn't give Sarah Henderson back her life, and we couldn't erase the decades of agonizing silence her family endured, but we made sure her name became a permanent beacon of illumination. The physical and emotional heartbeat of that illumination remained centered at the community memorial in the public park just a few blocks away. Beneath the broad, sheltering branches of ancient maple trees, the polished granite monument stood in pristine condition, its inscribed names catching the brilliant afternoon light. Throughout the warm August days, local residents, grieving relatives from across the state, and young police cadets completing their field training regularly stopped by to leave fresh white lilies, touch the engraved letters, and reflect upon the enduring lessons of the investigation. The memorial served as a daily reminder that justice is never merely a matter of legal statutes or courtroom verdicts. It is an active, ongoing commitment to truth, vigilance, and the absolute refusal to look away when things don't quite add up. Far away from the sunlit parks and quiet residential streets of Mansfield, deep within the maximum security state penitentiary, Arthur Miller existed in absolute, unrelenting isolation. Locked inside his 12-by-8-foot segregation cell, he was cut off from every external comfort, every professional ambition, and every illusion of control that had once fueled his arrogance. The fluorescent ceiling fixture hummed with a monotonous, sterile frequency, casting a harsh, white glare over the cold concrete walls and the solid steel bars of his door. The precise drafting tools, the expansive architectural blueprints, and the complex mental calculations of his past were entirely gone, stripped away by the unalterable permanence of consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Arthur sat motionless on the edge of his steel-framed bunk, his orange correctional jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame, his pale blue eyes fixed unblinkingly on the solid concrete wall opposite his cell door. He received no mail, refused all visits from distant acquaintances, and lived entirely erased from the society he had once manipulated with such cold, calculated precision. The architect who fancied himself a master of concealment and structural perfection had been thoroughly dismantled by the very system of justice he had mocked, reduced to a nameless, forgotten inmate spending his remaining years in total, inescapable silence. The elaborate subterranean vaults he had engineered to outlast time had become his philosophical tomb, an absolute, inescapable end for a predator who had built his entire existence on a foundation of lies. Back in Mansfield, the late afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of amber, violet, and rose. A gentle evening breeze swept down Elm Tree Lane, rustling the leaves of the mature oak trees that canopied the street. The street lamps flickered on one by one in steady, automated sequence, casting warm pools of golden light across the clean sidewalks and welcoming front porches where neighbors gathered to talk quietly as the stars began to emerge in the vast, open sky above. The quarter-century nightmare that had held the community in its icy grip was fully, irrevocably resolved. The vaults were sealed, the verdicts were absolute, and the dark chapter was permanently closed. The shadow had lifted, leaving behind a community bathed in the unyielding, permanent light of truth, justice, and enduring peace. The crisp, vibrant air of early autumn September 2027 descended upon Mansfield, painting the tree-lined avenues of the city in rich shades of amber, crimson, and gold. On Elm Tree Lane, the open, clover-covered patch of earth where number 412 had once stood had settled completely into the surrounding landscape, its smooth, green expanse serving as a silent, peaceful reminder of a neighborhood that had successfully reclaimed its identity from the clutches of historical trauma. The daily routines of the block, children riding their bicycles home from school, postal workers exchanging friendly waves with residents on front porches, and families tending to their autumn gardens, proceeded with an easy, unburdened grace that would have been entirely unimaginable just a year prior. Inside the Richland County Police Division, the institutional changes forged during the investigation had become second nature to the dedicated personnel working under Chief Evelyn Carter. The Interagency Cold Case Clearinghouse, powered by advanced short tandem repeat DNA profiling and rigorous oversight of historical commercial contracting records, was operating as a permanent, nationwide benchmark for investigative excellence. In the primary conference room, Chief Carter and Special Agent Thomas Vance reviewed the final federal compliance reports confirming that regional police departments across the entire Midwest had fully integrated the Mansfield protocols into their standard operating procedures. The latest audit from the Department of Justice is official, Vance said, closing a comprehensive ledger and looking across the table at Carter with a steady, satisfied expression. Every state across our region has adopted the automated cross-border DNA matching and historical permit auditing framework we pioneered during the Arthur Miller investigation. What began as a desperate search for Sarah Henderson in a dusty, forgotten file cabinet has permanently closed the escape routes for predatory criminals nationwide. The administrative silos that protected men like Arthur for decades have been dismantled brick by brick. Carter nodded, resting her hands on the polished wooden surface of the table as her gaze drifted toward the framed photograph of the public park memorial hanging on the wall. Arthur spent his entire life believing that he was an intellectual superior, orchestrating an empire of concealment beneath concrete and silence, Carter said, her voice resonant with quiet authority. He thought he could outsmart history by hiding his victims where no one would ever look. But he completely miscalculated the enduring power of human persistence. He didn't realize that memory outlives mortar, and that science will always catch up to darkness. We couldn't bring Sarah back, and we couldn't erase the decades of agonizing silence her family endured, but we made sure her name became a permanent, unalterable beacon of illumination. The physical and emotional anchor of that illumination remained centered at the community memorial in the public park just a few blocks away. Beneath the grand, sheltering boughs of ancient maples, the polished granite monument stood in pristine condition, its deep-set engravings catching the crisp morning sunlight. Throughout the cool September days, local residents, grieving relatives from across the state, and young police officers completing their advanced training regularly stopped by to leave fresh autumn flowers, touch the engraved letters, and reflect upon the lessons of the investigation. The memorial remained a sanctuary of grace, a daily reminder that justice is never merely a passive legal outcome, but an active, ongoing commitment to truth, vigilance, and the absolute refusal to look away when things don't quite add up. Far away from the sunlit parks and peaceful neighborhoods of Mansfield, deep within the maximum security state penitentiary, Arthur Miller existed in absolute, unrelenting isolation. Locked inside his 12 by 8-foot segregation cell, he was cut off from every external comfort, every professional ambition, and every illusion of control that had once fueled his profound arrogance. The fluorescent ceiling fixture hummed with a monotonous, sterile frequency, casting a harsh, white glare over the cold concrete walls and the solid steel bars of his door. The precise drafting tools, the expansive architectural blueprints, and the complex mental calculations of his past were entirely gone, stripped away by the unalterable permanence of consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Arthur sat motionless on the edge of his steel-framed bunk, his orange correctional jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame, his pale blue eyes fixed unblinkingly on the solid concrete wall opposite his cell door. He received no mail, refused all visits from distant acquaintances, and lived entirely erased from the society he had once manipulated with such cold, calculated precision. The architect who fancied himself a master of concealment and structural perfection had been thoroughly dismantled by the very system of justice he had mocked, reduced to a nameless, forgotten inmate spending his remaining years in total, inescapable silence. The elaborate subterranean vaults he had engineered to outlast time had become his philosophical tomb, an absolute, inescapable end for a predator who had built his entire existence on a foundation of lies. Back in Mansfield, the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the autumn sky in brilliant hues of copper, violet, and pale gold. A gentle evening breeze swept down Elm Tree Lane, rustling the colorful leaves of the mature oak trees that canopied the street. The street lamps flickered on one by one in steady, automated sequence, casting warm pools of golden light across the clean sidewalks and welcoming front porches where neighbors gathered to talk quietly as the first stars began to emerge in the vast, open sky above. The quarter-century nightmare that had held the community in its icy grip was fully, irrevocably resolved. The vaults were sealed, the verdicts were absolute, and the dark chapter was permanently closed. The shadow had lifted, leaving behind a community bathed in the unyielding, permanent light of truth, justice, and enduring peace. The crisp autumn air of late September 2027 settled deeply over the rolling hills and quiet neighborhoods of Mansfield, Ohio, wrapping the city in a tranquil, amber-hued stillness. On Elm Tree Lane, the open, clover-covered expanse where number 412 once stood had blended completely into the natural topography of the block. To any casual observer driving down the shaded avenue, the street appeared entirely ordinary, a peaceful suburban sanctuary where children walked home from school with bright backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Postal carriers exchanged friendly waves with homeowners sweeping fallen leaves from their steps, and front porches welcomed families back from the long workday. Yet, beneath the serene surface of this ordinary American neighborhood lay the enduring proof of a community that had stared directly into the abyss of its darkest historical trauma, dismantled its foundation brick by brick, and emerged into the unyielding light of absolute truth and permanent resolution. Inside the Richland County Police Division, the institutional changes forged during the grueling investigation into Arthur Miller's multi-decade crimes had become standard operating procedure. Chief Evelyn Carter sat at her polished wooden desk, reviewing the final comprehensive implementation report submitted by the multi-jurisdictional task force. Across from her, Special Agent Thomas Vance was organizing the permanent archival binders that would be shipped to the State Historical Society and the Department of Justice Archives. The advanced short tandem repeat DNA profiling systems, the automated cross-border missing persons clearinghouse, and the rigorous oversight of historical commercial contracting records were now operating with clockwork precision across every county in Ohio and throughout the broader Midwest. The federal compliance audit is officially complete, Vance said, closing a thick leather binder and looking across the desk with a steady, satisfied expression. Every regional precinct from the shores of Lake Erie down to the Ohio River has fully integrated our investigative protocols into their daily operations. The administrative silos and jurisdictional blind spots that allowed Arthur Miller to operate in plain sight for 30 years have been completely eradicated. Detectives handling historical cold cases in other states are utilizing the very same forensic frameworks we developed right here in Mansfield to bring closure to families who have spent decades waiting in the dark. Arthur spent a lifetime building walls to keep his crimes buried, but his actions inadvertently became the blueprint for a national revolution in cold case jurisprudence. Carter nodded slowly, her gaze resting on the framed photograph of the public park memorial hanging on her office wall. Arthur was consumed by his own arrogance, Carter replied, her voice resonant with quiet, unwavering authority. He truly believed he was an intellectual superior, orchestrating an empire of concealment beneath concrete and silence. He thought he could outsmart human history by hiding his victims where no one would ever look. But he completely miscalculated the enduring power of human persistence. He didn't realize that memory outlives mortar, and that science will always catch up to darkness. We couldn't bring Sarah Henderson back, and we couldn't erase the decades of agonizing silence her family endured, but we made sure her name became a permanent, unalterable beacon of illumination. The physical and emotional anchor of that illumination remained centered at the community memorial in the public park just a few blocks away. Beneath the grand, sheltering boughs of ancient maples, the polished granite monument stood in pristine condition, its deep-set engravings catching the crisp morning sunlight. Throughout the cool autumn days, local residents, grieving relatives from across the state, and young police officers completing their advanced training regularly stopped by to leave fresh autumn flowers, touch the engraved letters, and reflect upon the lessons of the investigation. The memorial remained a sanctuary of grace, a daily reminder that justice is never merely a passive legal outcome, but an active, ongoing commitment to truth, vigilance, and the absolute refusal to look away when things don't quite add up. Far away from the sunlit parks and peaceful neighborhoods of Mansfield, deep within the maximum security state penitentiary, Arthur Miller existed in absolute, unrelenting isolation. Locked inside his